Hi, welcome back guys. This is your friend, the MHA What If with another fanfiction. This is the second part of What If Deku Became Shigaraki's Obsession? All credits for this video go to their respective authors, so please support the real author. Check out the link in the description for more details. Please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel if you want more videos like this. Now let's get into the fanfic. Midoriya had to speed walk to school and arrived to class more tired than he was when he left the hideout. He slumped over his desk and sighed heavily at his terrible morning. It was almost made better when Todoroki showed up, but to see him taken away by Endeavor so forcefully while he was so helpless to do anything, he felt terrible. He didn't even say anything. He should have said something. He should have said anything. But there was always the chance that Todoroki's situation could have gotten worse if he did. The thoughts of what he could have done bothered him all of his classes. He took his school notes and personal notes, but all of his second thoughts still lingered. Even when Present Mike began teaching his English lessons, giving everyone a chance and being more than helpful with any questions, not even his personality and kindness was enough to distract him. He hated school, but he could always be comforted by the fact that he had a home to go back to where a big brother and a father figure were there to make him feel better. But Todoroki, he didn't have that. It was recently that his sister came back, but he must have spent most of his life with just his father. Todoroki must look forward to coming back to school. How miserable he must be knowing he couldn't be happy in his own home. When it came to the observation period, Midoriya was drawn to the Class 1A monitor again to watch their latest lesson. At the moment, they had all changed into their hero costumes for the first time. He remembered the little green suit his mother had made for him so long ago. He remembered the page he ripped out of his notebook that had a design for his impossible future. It wasn't the time to think about dreams that never had a chance to be. Instead of lingering on that, he scanned the line of students to find Todoroki in all white with ice covering his entire left half. It made him frown, knowing Todoroki didn't like that half of himself. It was to the point where he didn't want anyone to see it. But someone looked very angry at his costume. Some kid with black spiky hair and golden eyes had strutted up to him with a costume that resembled armor made of dragon scales with clawed gauntlets. It was that fire-breather kid that gave him a hard time on the first day. Why was he looking at Todoroki that way? Why was he getting that close to him? He had a toothy smirk like Bakugo, but there was a lot more determination and cockiness in his face. Midoriya scanned the list of names on the lower screen to try and figure out who this guy was. A fire-breathing quirk, he remembered. Kosuka hero? What Midoriya was feeling was not jealousy. The emotion he was reading on Kosuka's face was not flirtatious. It was a sense of mockery and cruel attitude. All the students had mics on their costumes, so the students observing could hear their conversations through headphones and alternate on who to listen to. And thus Midoriya grabbed a headset and shifted a knob on it to listen to the mics of students 15 and 18. Why are you covering the fire half of you, huh? I know you. Kosuka sneered, keeping his hands in the pockets of his black scaly costume. I didn't think there'd be another fire user in my class. Don't think I'm going to let some rich son of a famous hero show me up. Todoroki kept usually quiet, standing his ground but not letting any emotion show on his face. He was so quiet so often. He had a sharp tongue when he got pushed, but he usually tried to keep it back. I plan on being a hero without it. It's pointless making a competition out of something I'll never use, he said calmly, turning his body to try and show that he didn't care for this conversation. But Kosuka was not satisfied with that answer as small flames came out of his nose in a huff. So you think you're better than me? Is that what that is? Think you can show everyone up with only half your power? I never said that. But I plan on it. Then show me your fire if you think you're that much better than me. I don't have to show you anything. Midoriya gritted his teeth the moment he saw Kosuka grab the collar of Todoroki's shirt, but he let go when All Might appeared before them. He could see where the relationship between the two was going to end up. It was going to be some petty rivalry, but it was a rivalry that Todoroki did not want any part of. Midoriya would watch the first training period for the hero course where the students were in groups of 2, pinned against each other to either apprehend the other group or having one tag a fake bomb in a skyscraper. The school must have had a massive budget to create these fake cities just to have them destroyed. He watched the first be between the little brother of Ingenium and Bakugo against some girl in pink and Kosuka. He at least got his dose of entertainment watching Bakugo and Kosuka fight each other mindlessly out of their own arrogant personalities while the girl in pink confronted the guy in glasses. Observing two hotheads yelling at each other and call each other a weakling was very funny. It was like they shared a single brain cell that could only understand pettiness. They were both angry, mindless fools. A few fights later, Midoriya found himself in nothing but all watching the bare minimum of Todoroki's power. He froze an entire building with one touch and was able to complete the assignment by himself without hurting anyone. Such a pure heart. He was so talented. He was so calm. He was smart to know exactly what to do with an invisible opponent. There was minimal damage to the building. Midoriya quickly turned the knob on his headset to listen to Mike's numbers 17 and 18. He smirked hearing them. They were both silent for a couple of moments, stunned by how quickly and effortlessly Todoroki won while the two of them were roughed up and burned from each other. How do I can't beat that. Bakugo's voice stuttered, making Midoriya's face blush. How terrified he sounded. How weak. Pathetic. Hopeless. His eyes sparkled at the sound of his former bully stuttering and trembling. That bastard, Kosuka growled. The lunch period afterward, Midoriya eagerly sat at the table where he and Todoroki were the day before. He looked around for him with anticipation, ready to shower him with praise the moment he sat down. He had such an amazing quirk after all. He knew exactly how to control it to an impressive extent. It was a beautiful display. He deserved to know how impressive he was. However, when Midoriya did spot his beautiful hero, he glared at a student next to him that was pestering him. Kosuka walked beside Todoroki and kept bumping him with his arm while they both held trays. Use your fire next time, damn it. It's like you're mocking me, Kosuka said bitterly, flames slipping through the cracks of his teeth. But Todoroki remained collected and walked as steadily as he could while being bumped. I don't need to. This bratty student didn't deserve an explanation, nor should he expect one. You really piss me off. You're just a spoiled rich kid. Midoriya stood up from his chair, quick enough to knock it back when he saw Kosuka lose his temper at Todoroki's unwillingness to use his fire. He felt mocked and degraded from being unrecognized by the number 2 hero's son. But his temper was just as nasty, if not worse than Bakugo's. Midoriya and many other students watched as the fire breather took his tray and swung it to hit Todoroki in the side of his head. All the food on the tray fell to the floor as Todoroki dropped his on impact. The sound of clanging metal drew a few students' attention and they went completely silent. Would a fight break out between the two? Would Kosuka get his wish? He was smirking cockily, expecting the half-and-half hero to challenge him. However, his expectations were not met. Midoriya ran up to the two students and put a hand on Todoroki's shoulder and looked at him with panic in his eyes. Todoroki dashed, he began to say, wondering if he had gotten badly hurt. Todoroki had his hand up against the side of his head where he was hit. Pulling it back, he checked to see if he was bleeding. He wasn't. And Midoriya noticed the lack of blood too. But he was still furious, turning to look back at Kosuka with a narrowed glare. He'll die. If a student had to go, this one will die. Midoriya's tired eyes locked on Kosuka's as he kept both his hands protectively on his beautiful hero. Just leave him alone, the freckled villain demanded. His heart shattered when he felt Todoroki get to the ground and pick up the food that had been soiled from falling on the floor. He piled it all onto the tray in a mess before getting back up in silence. Why wouldn't he say anything? Why wouldn't he defend himself? Midoriya watched him throw out the food he had just gotten, only salvaging a single milk carton, painfully. Why was he acting just like Midoriya used to? None of your business, shorty. Kosuka lightly shoved past Midoriya and went off elsewhere in the cafeteria but was hastily chased after by the tall guy with glasses. He looked like the type to give annoying lectures to his classmates, even though he was the same rank and age as them. Ignoring that scene, Midoriya returned to the table that Todoroki sat at, across from the fallen-over chair. He just sipped his drink quietly while everyone slowly started to go back to their previous conversations. Todoroki? Midoriya picked his chair up and sat down, leaning a bit closer to try and get a better look at his beautiful hero even though his head was lowered so his hair was blocking his face. He watched frost climb up his right cheek and up to his head where he was hit. The tips of his white hair froze. The sparkle of the ice made him look even prettier, but Midoriya chose not to say anything. "Do you want to hang out after school again today?" he asked softly with a small smile to try to give him the opportunity to feel better. "We could go somewhere closer. Like a cafe or dashed." Todoroki rubbed the side of his head with his palm and cut the freckled teenager off. "I got scolded yesterday. I don't feel like dealing with him again today, so another time," he said so quietly with a deeper tone. Midoriya's forced smile fell at his answer. It sounded like he would have liked to spend time together again, but his father would be troublesome because of how late he would get home. Endeavor was clearly the no-nonsense kind of parent in addition to his strictness and abusive parenting. He didn't want Todoroki to get any more injuries, so he wouldn't try to persuade him to go out again soon. "Why, you must be hungry still. Here." Midoriya took a napkin and folded it on his tray to start taking pieces of meat out of his katsudon, as well as some noodles, and placing them on the napkin. "I just stand around all day. You need your strength for training this afternoon. And I don't eat a lot anyway." He pushed his tray forward to offer half his meal to Todoroki with a desperate look on his face. He didn't eat much already, having lost weight since entering his villain lifestyle. Work overtook his focus on nutrition, but Todoroki had muscle and needed to eat to function. So the little villain was more than willing to share more than half of his meal. Todoroki looked at the food he was offered so generously. He made just the smallest, shortest exhale through his nose that could be mistaken for a scoff. But Midoriya knew it was something else. Todoroki didn't communicate like other people. He didn't know how to. And the little villain picked up on this very quickly because he felt the air around him heating up again. It wasn't a coincidence that this happened every time he said or did something nice for him. "You're too kind," the hero said softly, taking chopsticks from the table to eat off the napkin. "You're too kind," Midoriya said back, emphasizing the "you're." Todoroki didn't fight Kosuke back despite being stronger than him. He could have annihilated him. But he held back. Different chemicals produce different flowers that produce different effects of the spores, Midoriya muttered, reading in his notes in his laboratory. There was a female sidekick restrained to his table, her body scattered with lines of stitches and her arms were swollen with needle puncture wounds. Her hair was green and damp with sweat, her face shiny with tears. She was kept alive from the day before, and now the afternoon Midoriya returned from school. In Midoriya's notebook, her quirk was labeled as variety spores. In the palms of her hands, flowers with mangled vines were sprouting and beginning to wilt, and her veins were bulging for the intensity. "Try not to die from this one." Midoriya bent under his table to pick up a gas mask and put it on. He filled a syringe with a chemical from a bottle with giant warnings on it. It was lethal. The subject on his table screamed through a gag as she tried to pull her restrained arm away from this emotionless villain. But there was emotion in his face when he giggled at her fear. He still felt a twisted pleasure when heroes feared him. How scary a little quirkless boy was. He poked his masked cheeks and his eyes angled in a cute smile. "Your quirk is so fascinating. Thank you so much for letting me study it. Maybe I could get your autograph if you can get through this," he teased, having a fake fanboyish tone. He could only see quirks in action when his subjects were alive. It was the perks of stepping up from corpses. He could ask questions, force quirks to work with drugs Shigaraki provided him, study them at his own pace and will. The power he held with needles and a scalpel was incredible when his victims were restrained. While the poor sidekick struggled, Midoriya stabbed her wrist with the syringe and injected her with a fast-acting poison. He watched flowers start to sprout all over her body and release hundreds of spores, her veins turning black and bulging intensely. He lifted a small electronic device in his hand that measured the quality of air and appeared fascinated by it, taking more notes. Quirks almost mutate when in life-threatening situations. He mumbled quietly before taking more specific notes. He let the sidekick woman spasm, scream, and cry without a second glance. By the time he finished writing a few pages of notes, his laboratory had become silent. His eyes slowly trailed to his table where the sidekick was still and lifeless, Her eyes wide opened and the flowers on her body began to wilt. "So you did die?" He shrugged, turning to the front pages of his notebook where he had a picture of her and a small family tree. "Pollen in it?" He crossed out her picture and looked at the one he had next to it, a sibling. He couldn't help but smirk at the picture of the Venus flytrap hero he saw this morning, the one that left him under a light pole and apprehended the giant villain instead. "Hope you didn't like your little sister too much?" He giggled. Midoriya cleaned up his laboratory like he always did after work. Shigaraki spent a lot of resources providing all of this for him so he would not treat it poorly. Washing all his tools, sterilizing the floor and tables, organizing notes, labeling on a piece of paper near the elevator door which chemicals he used and would need to be restocked. There was so much pride in his work. Yet he did not burn the corpse yet. Not being wasteful, he would save it for more research later. How many corpses he had gone through outnumbered his 2 living subjects. He needed to take advantage of all his resources. He turned on an air vent before going up the elevator to his apartment floor, going to his room to instantly take a shower and clean himself of any poisonous spores and chemicals. He would not even consider the risk of accidentally hurting Shigaraki. After doing so, he went to the bar in Todoroki's white hoodie that was very baggy on him now, a pair of shorts, and a towel over his head to dry his wet hair. He came down the stairs to see his big brother watching the news on the small TV with Kurogyari and some stranger he hadn't seen before. It was an older man with glasses and a missing tooth. Midoriya quietly walked up behind Shigaraki with the hand on his face and the stranger, peeking at the TV and listening closely. For several months, mysterious disappearances have been occurring all over the city and nearby, very populated, cities. It has come to our attention that the sudden increase in the disappearances of civilians and heroes may be linked. The police have been overwhelmed with reports and information due to the sheer number of people affected. And so the police and detective agencies are asking for help for pro-heroes to join their search for the one behind the missing claims of over 30 people and to put an end to the villains behind these crimes. The screen began showing images of crime scenes that were taken over the past months that showed signs of minor struggle, with some looking more concerning than others. The most recent disappearance, according to detectives, may involve the sidekick Pollenina. She went missing 2 days ago on Dash. Shigaraki muted the TV and looked to the stranger and then Midoriya, noticing the little villain coming to join them. "So they're finally on to us," Shigaraki commented. "But it looks like they're having a hard time tracking you down. They're getting desperate and asking heroes for help now," the stranger said, folding his arms with a smirk. He then noticed Midoriya a bit behind him from the corner of his eye and smiled. "So this is that kid you've been telling me about?" He's Midoriya's eyes narrowed in a petty glare, knowing exactly what this old man was about to say. He's not as intimidating as he thought. He's smaller than he expected. He's cuter than one would imagine. He knew he didn't look intimidating like this. "Izuku, this is Jiren. The guy that's gonna learn everything he can about Endeavor's first son." Shigaraki stopped Jiren from finding the words he wanted to say and instead moved straight to business. "Well, I'm going to try. Not much I can do without a face or name. But with a celebrity dad, I'm sure I can find some people to work with. And I also came to drop this off for ya." Jiren patted a cardboard box that was on the bar counter with a grin. "Shigaraki ordered it, so if you don't like it, talk to him." Midoriya looked up at the box curiously and watched Kurogyari cut it open with a small knife and leaning over the counter to hand it to him. The little villain took the box and went to the sofa to open and pick through it while the older villains talked, and Kurogyari even gave them mild shots. "So what are you planning?" Jiren asked, sitting down and taking a small sip. "After the doctor gives me that thing, we're going to sneak into UA and kill All Might with it. We'll plan in advance and I'll get Grunts to cause irresistible trouble during his commute to wear him out." Shigaraki began telling his info broker his fairly simple plan to get into the school using the media and mentioned Midoriya notes that he's been receiving and looking over. And meanwhile, the little villain began pulling out pieces of clothing out of the box. There were classy clothes with a vest and tie, and yet the button-up and pants didn't seem to feel like they were supposed to. They were stiffer and the fabric appeared to be very sturdy. A villain costume? At the bottom of the box was a metal mouth mask with air ventilation holes, and it was decorated with a terrifying tooth design. The design resembled a smiling shark mouth. He put the piece over his mouth and made a noise to have it mix his voice into a lower octave, a piece to help hide his identity. No one would be able to recognize his voice with the mask on. Another piece at the bottom of the box was a mask for the upper half of his face that was completely white except for the holes for the eyes that were enlarged with black tint over them. Midoriya held his masks in his hands and had the clothes in his lap, looking to Shigaraki, who was still conversing with Jiren and Kurogiri. He suddenly felt like crying. He wanted to run up to him and thank him. But not while Jiren was here. If Shigaraki had his hand on his face, it meant he didn't trust Jiren fully or that he was trying to keep his presence intimidating to be taken seriously. If Shigaraki ordered this costume, he must have designed it too. Midoriya kept feeling the shirt and pants to feel how strong they were. It wasn't armor, but it was not something a knife would be able to cut. He was so grateful for it. Jiren left after about an hour and Shigaraki slumped over the counter, taking the hand off his face and instead put it on the top of his head as he mixed a groan with a sigh. His social stamina power had run completely dry. Midoriya put his costume back in the box and got up onto the stool next to tired Big Brother. Before bothering him, he looked at the sum of the liquid left in Jiren's cup and subtly tried reaching for it to have Kurogiri take it away casually. Midoriya made a small pout but let it pass when he put his cheek on the counter to look at the half-drunk adult next to him. "Hate people that much, huh?" he asked just to get a grunt as an answer. "Have you, ever had a crush on someone?" Use this opportunity to get more ammunition to tease his big brother. You get so tired after talking to people for a few minutes that you need to drink to keep going. Have you ever liked someone so much that you don't have to do that? Shigaraki lifted his face and just glared at his little brother, but it was annoyed rather than hateful. "Never. I hate people," he grumbled. "No way in hell I'm gonna end up chasing after a pretty Prince Charming like you." He poked the freckled boy's chest pathetically. Midoriya was not bothered by the weak poke and instead just cared more to watch his big brother. He's never had feelings for someone. Ever. No friends. Doesn't remember his family. He and Kurogiri didn't seem that close. What made this little freckled boy he found on the streets so special? Midoriya sat in class the next morning, doodling in his school notebook. He smiled peacefully to himself as he drew himself in the villain costume Shigaraki designed for him. His heart was so giddy for it. He destroyed the sketches of his dream hero costume long ago when he realized how pointless it was to have a goal like that. But now he had this. He longed for the day he could wear it out. "I totally saw him messing with someone yesterday. I bet he has girls lift their skirts for him and they won't remember what happened. That's so gross. He has to use it on his parents. All the time." The little villain found himself distracted by his classmates' gossip once again and knew that they were talking about Shinso. His eyes trailed away from his drawing and glared at the students and then checked to see the purple-haired boy was doing. Did he ever hear what people were saying about him? And surely he was sitting at his desk and covering his ears with his elbows on the tabletop. He had his eyes shut. Was he trying to block them out? Midoriya wouldn't doubt that he was accustomed to this kind of gossip bullying, but he couldn't help but pity him. He had always been so focused and devoted to studying class 1A and B whenever it was observation period. He was the one who asked Present Mike about them. Midoriya felt a small twinge in his chest. He knew exactly what he was feeling. "He's always one female student started to say when Midoriya slammed his pen on the desk to make just a loud enough noise to stop her from talking. "Could you guys shut up about him for once? It's so annoying, like a bunch of elementary schoolers. And none of it's true and you know it. You don't even know him," he growled with a dark glare and went back to his doodling. He wasn't going to start a fight over it because he would surely lose. Everyone knew he was quirkless. Luckily, the students became too flustered to say anything back and slowly scattered awkwardly. Some people can't handle being called out so bluntly. That call-out got Shinso to look back at Midoriya and blink a few times at him, uncovering his ears gradually. In a different homeroom class, Todoroki sat down at his desk, receiving a simple good morning from Yaoyorozu Momo and returning it monotoned. He tried to keep his eyes on his phone but couldn't help himself and glance a few times at Kosuke at his desk, having a glare off with Bakugo. At least he was distracted. But he felt someone bump into his desk and looked up at the Ida Tenya standing beside him with a glint in his glasses. He was standing there in absolute silence like he was trying to think of something to say, and it was taking him way longer than he anticipated. I don't believe that we have officially talked before. But I am Ida Tenya, your classmate? Todoroki nodded at this, not being one of many words with strangers. It has come to my attention that you and Kosuke haven't been getting along. And I thought I would ask you if your head still hurts from yesterday. Todoroki shook his head. No, it's okay now. Then he went back to scrolling at nothing but news articles on his phone and not reading any of them. Well, I would like to invite you to sit with your other classmates and myself this afternoon to build a stronger relationship. Ida started waving his arm in a very strange fashion to get his attention again. I'm okay sitting with Midoriya. He was getting pretty close to the freckled villain. Then I would like to invite you both. I would hate for Kosuke to ruin the reputation of the rest of the class for you. I also believe it would help us all become friends. Todoroki focused his eyes elsewhere at the offer. I'm not really here to make friends, he admitted. But I'll ask if Midoriya would like that. I guess it's okay, Midoriya said begrudgingly as the two walked to the lunchroom together. Todoroki now had a bandage on his right cheek from a small burn from Kosuke during combat training that afternoon. It was more than clear that the fire-breathing student had it out for him now. Midoriya and Todoroki had split up to get their meals, and even while the hero student was in line, Kosuke purposely kept stepping on his heel to make it bleed by the time he was out of line. And yet there was no reaction from him, being passive and unwilling to start a fight. Sitting down with all these familiar yet new faces made him quieter than average, and Midoriya noticed. Like usual, he was a good listener, watching and paying attention to all the colorful students around him. But he never cared to add to the conversation. How Midoriya longed to hear his voice. They were just wasting their precious time together. He didn't want to watch and think about his beautiful hero anymore, he wanted to interact with him. But surrounded by all these people, they were both rendered silent by awkwardness and introverted nature. Bakugo sure has a flashy quirk, huh? Too bad his personality isn't as bright. Uraraka giggled, casually making fun of the student that was further down the table and keeping to a small group of boys who were also teasing him. The spiky redhead sitting next to him looked the most comfortable. But Todoroki's power is incredible. With just one half, you've made quite an impression on everyone. Ida added, shifting the conversation and looking to Todoroki to include himself. Midoriya subtly gritted his teeth. Who did this jock nerd think he was? He thinks he can just waltz into Todoroki's life and try to be best friends with him? Inviting him to sit with him at lunch, approaching him in homeroom, making small talk during combat training earlier that afternoon, what was he trying to do? If this was jealousy, he hated it. He hated how Todoroki was avoiding eye contact with everyone until Ida mentioned him. And now that blue-haired loser got his attention. Midoriya wanted that attention. Your quirk is amazing, Todoroki, and you control it so well. How do you do it? Ida pressed. Lots of focus and hard work, I guess. Abuse. Your skills are very impressive. You should take pride in your perseverance. Ida smiled as he complimented him, which made the little villain's blood run hot. Thinking he could just flatter him like that and suddenly get on his good side. What the villain and hero had couldn't be compared to this nobody they just met. It probably just means he worthless with the other half of himself. Kosuke walked by and elbowed Todoroki in the back of his head, to which he still refused to react. Midoriya took hold of his hero and tried to protect him from any other attempted attacks. And just as he was about to open his mouth to say something, Ida stood up out of his seat and slammed his hand on the table. Your attitude and attacks towards Todoroki are not appropriate, nor are they called for. I think I speak for everyone when I politely ask you to stop harassing our classmate. If this continues any longer, I would have no other option than to report you to Mr. Aizawa. He barked but stood tall and firm. Kosuke only scoffed and shrugged the threat off. Rich kids stick together, I guess. You're part of that Ingenium family, right? Chip on your shoulder and stick up your ass. Mind your own damn business, he sneered, walking off without another issue. But Midoriya became even angrier when he felt the air around him become warm all of a sudden. He glanced at Todoroki's face to see a slight red tint to his cheeks. It wasn't fair. Midoriya had been dying to see Todoroki since he was saved by him. He was doing everything he could to give him his brother back and coming up with a way to take him away from Endeavor. Why was this four-eyed bastard able to make him so happy so quickly? But he couldn't be mad at his beloved, beautiful hero. 4 days, Midoriya would watch him during the observation period. Kosuke continued to be subtle but relentless in his insults. He selfishly kept challenging him to use his left half. It was then he began doing it when Ida wasn't around, any chance he got. Stepping on his heels, hitting him, shoving him, trying to trip him, stealing or vandalizing his things. Midoriya was noticing all these little actions at lunch. Todoroki continued to sit with his class to be left in peace, and the little villain always sat with him. He wasn't going to let Ida take him away. But more than anything, he didn't want Todoroki to be just like him. Home was miserable with his father, and then his only safe place was school. But that had been ruined by Kosuke's bullying. It was predatory. He only went after Todoroki, thinking he as selfish and arrogant as the son of Endeavor. He was too inconsiderate to even think that there may be a reason he didn't use his fire. There was a scar on his face, it was impossible to miss. How could he not care to even assume that there was a personal reason involved in his actions? Midoriya was watching Todoroki become more reserved and silent. Talks at lunch were minimal until Ida and Yaoyorozu tried including him. But even then, he spent most of the time scrolling through nothing on his phone. At one point, Midoriya tapped his arm and held up his own phone with a blush. His screen was open to a new contact tab. Things became a bit better after that. Todoroki texted much more than he talked, although his texts were often one sentence or one word. Midoriya, you look tired. Todoroki, Endeavor has been inviting lots of people over late. Midoriya, why is that? Todoroki, he's trying to make his agency the head of the sudden disappearance case investigation. They were sitting next to each other at the lunch table. Midoriya stared at his phone and was caught off guard by the text. Endeavor was going to be leading the search for all the corpses and live subjects he's worked on. The police weren't messing around anymore. Midoriya, Endeavor doesn't seem like a great deductive thinker. Todoroki, his agency has smart people. He has an advantage in numbers. And he's a threat to scare the V. Midoriya looked over at Todoroki to see his eyes closing for a few seconds at a time. He seemed so exhausted. Home sucked. School sucked. There was no in-between to be had because his father would prevent him from staying after. He must not have been sleeping well with stress and feeling overwhelmed. Midoriya, you should come over sometime. My mom would be happy to have you. She's really nice. Midoriya, do you want to go somewhere quiet? I'll wake you up when lunch is over. Todoroki then turned to look at Midoriya and nodded slowly. His eyes were as cold as ever, but there was so much more sadness in them these days. The little villain was able to recognize that sadness from himself back in middle school. At least right now, Todoroki didn't have to be alone with his repressed emotions. And so the two started to get up out of their seats, though Todoroki was a little quicker. He must have been eager for a nap, even if it would only be for a few minutes. Midoriya also stayed at the table a couple of moments longer to gather the remains of his lunch, and there was a lot because he never had an appetite. And it was while his back was turned when there was a loud clatter. It was the sound of a tray and everything on it falling, but also a whole person hitting the ground. When Midoriya looked back, his eyes appeared to glow once again. His anger reached a new level in what he saw. He began to tremble and his hands gripped his tray so tightly that he made a dent. Todoroki was soaked and on the ground, water steaming on his clothes and skin with Kosuke holding a large steaming cup in his hand, looking more annoyed and frustrated than normal. Tea too hot for you, rich kid? Your flames must be weak as hell if that hurts. I'm so tired of you being a coward. He snapped, not realizing the severity of what he had done. He knelt down and grabbed Todoroki by his shirt to try and force him to face him. But the soaked hero was covering his left eye instinctively with his right side frosting over. The bandage had fallen off and blood began to drip from his cheek. You think you can just ignore me forever? He refused to look at him. He wouldn't start a fight, not when it was common knowledge that his father would find out and it would be placed on his record. It was then that Kosuke would be hit in the side of the head by a metal tray with full force. Of course, Midoriya's full force was pathetic due to his small stature and petiteness. But that didn't mean he could give someone a bruise or two. Kosuke's head turned on impact, but his body remained still. The hero course was on a whole different level of strength and durability. By now, the little interaction in the back of the cafeteria had everyone's attention, including someone with purple hair, all the way in the back by himself. Kosuke. This is not dash. Ida began to take the initiative of breaking up the tension that was rising quickly. But his reaction was not quick enough to stop Kosuke from smirking with sharp teeth as he threw Todoroki a few feet to the side on the ground and puffed a small flame at Midoriya. You're the quirkless kid that hangs out with him, shouldn't you hate him more than anyone? Kosuke breathed, flexing his hands and cracking his wrists in the process. His nails were sharp, like his gauntlets for his costume. He deserves to be called a hero more than anyone in this room, Midoriya growled, with a glow still bright in his eyes. He wanted to kill him. He wanted to kill him so bad. He wanted him on his table, screaming and begging for mercy. He wanted him to apologize and pray for Todoroki's forgiveness. He didn't deserve to breathe the same air as his hero. He didn't deserve to live. Kosuke scoffed at Midoriya, feeling no intimidation from him. Instead, he walked over to Todoroki and went to step on his shoulder while he just laid on his side. Todoroki was just so tired. He didn't want to make trouble. He just wanted a nap. His eyes were nearly closed when he heard a small tussle above him. He looked up sleepily to see Midoriya grabbing onto Kosuke's shoulders to pull him back from stepping on him. Midoriya, don't get dash, Todoroki mumbled, trying to keep his closest friend from getting in trouble now. You little nobody. Kosuke flailed to try and get the little villain to release him before he turned his head to breathe a hot flame directly at him, and one of his nails swiped across his face, directly over his right eye. He's been coming to class with bandages. I was going to ask him about it after the bell today. Something just doesn't feel right, Aizawa said, sitting in the teacher's lounge eating just a cup of noodles. All Might in his true form and Yamada sat near him at their desks, also enjoying their lunch breaks. Their training here is very demanding. Do you think that maybe he's been roughed up here? Hero work is very hard on all our bodies. All Might suggested, taking a small sip of tea. He looked down at the water and stared into his reflection. Hero work was very hard on his body in particular, and he knew it all too well. He excels in training. I haven't seen him wounded in class where he ends up getting more than mildly hurt. On the first day of class, Aizawa pulled on his scarf slightly and gestured to his neck. There were some on his neck. Yamada, who was oddly quiet, just listened and put his bento box down on the table in front of him and began typing on the computer, signing in and logging into a database. He wasn't subtle, and it received the attention of both teachers. Youngest of 4, one deceased, mother and father separated, mother lives in a psych ward. He's just with Endeavor, isn't he? Does he have friends or do any dumb teenager things? He put a hand to his chin and scratched at the hair above his lip. I've been told he's close to one of my students, but I don't know about anyone else. He remembered Midoriya looking for a certain someone on the first day. The quirkless boy has been watching him every day since. I've noticed Ida and Yaoyorozu making an effort to talk to him, but he's still very isolated. All Might answered, and his eyes averted to the side, putting the pieces of this conversation together. But I wouldn't think to do dash. Endeavor. Aizawa glanced at the number 1 hero with his arms folded. You went to high school with him, didn't you? He leaned over to eat a few more noodles. You think he'd be the type to have a bad temper or anything? Yamada took off his glasses, taking in what Aizawa was suggesting. He would never want to assume such a thing from the number 2 hero. But even the thought of a student being hurt in their own home. Well, he was never really dash. All Might rubbed the back of his neck when he began to answer, but the sound of the teacher's lounge door slamming open silenced him. The 3 teachers looked to the entrance to see Uraraka Ochako at the threshold, leaning on the doorframe, out of breath, and her face red with rising blood pressure. Mr. Aizawa. There's a fight in the cafeteria. Midoriya took a few steps back as he made a cry of pain, holding his eye as blood began dripping from his face. His hand was red with slightly burnt skin. In his motion of taking steps back, He sat down quickly and curled up to protect his face from further attacks. "Oh, fuck, damn it," he growled, quivering from the shock of his wounds. He didn't want to uncover his face, choosing to remain in darkness and squeezing his eyes tightly shut. Kosuke watched the villain recoil with a smirk until he sat down quivering. He noticed the blood starting to make a small puddle on the tile floor. His smirk dropped and his expression changed to that of mild panic. "Che. Why you're good, right?" The cafeteria began to heat up all of a sudden. And it became very hot incredibly fast. It was burning hot. Kosuke felt that his back may actually be on fire. "Todoroki, don't." Ida's voice shouted out only for the fire-breathing student to turn around, find Todoroki on his feet and his left fist on fire, shooting up under his jaw. Kosuke felt his bottom teeth slam into his upper ones and the flames on his fist burning away the skin underneath his chin. Before he could react or make a comment, Todoroki grabbed his spiky black hair and elbowed the back of his head to send his nose into the brunt of his knee. Kosuke backed up with a bleeding nose and a forced smirk. "Bet my fire's stronger." He took a deep inhale, but in the time it took to inhale, he finally got a good look at the boy he had been bullying for all this time. Todoroki stood in between Kosuke and Midoriya with his left half completely incinerated. The flames reached the ceiling and many students had to flee to further tables because the heat was so intense. It was difficult to look at him from the flames' brightness and the insane temperature pulsing from his power. Yet he stood silently, slightly hunched over with a single blue, glowing dot seen at the center of the inferno. Kosuke pathetically tried to breathe fire, but it was only engulfed by a small wave of fire that was summoned by a single swipe of Todoroki's finger. Todoroki's flames were stronger. Kosuke put his arm over his eyes as he was now feeling the effects of the heat emitting from his classmate. In doing so, he blocked Todoroki out of his vision, giving the half-and-half student an opportunity to get close and personal to him. Though as he got closer, the temperature was becoming less intense but flames were still prevalent. He kicked Kosuke in the gut, making him recoil further and putting him off balance. So he took the chance to kick him in the side and knock him to the ground, to which he got on top of him and wrapped his hands around his throat. "You can't breathe fire if you can't breathe," Todoroki said in a hushed voice, gripping Kosuke's neck tighter and tighter. Kosuke began clawing at his wrists, doing everything he can to try and pry him off. "You hurt him. I'll hurt you far worse." He was so quiet, no one would be able to hear him except the one below him. He stared at him without blinking, eyes wide and hypnotized by anger and something else. Something far more intense than just hatred and rage. He was so tired. He was so mad. He just wanted all these things he hated to go away. Far worse. "I'll fucking key dashed." His nails were digging into his throat and drawing blood when he felt his flames suddenly go out with a voice shouting at him from across the cafeteria. "Todoroki, that's enough." Aizawa yelled the loudest he ever had, causing many students to shiver in fear. His quirk was activated, causing all the heat to disappear and the flames to die in mere seconds. And it was like his voice snapped Todoroki out of his fit as the grip he had on Kosuke's neck loosened completely and he found himself paralyzed by confusion. What had he just done? That was the left half of him. He looked down at the student underneath him, coughing and gasping for breath again, finding that he too could not make any flames. He looked at his throat that was bruised, burned, and bleeding. He did that. He attacked him. He completely lost himself in his temper. He could only look at his hands as they shook from the sudden exertion of power. The left half of his uniform was black with char and severely singed. "You fucking asshole!" Kosuke screamed, taking the opportunity of confusion to try and tackle Todoroki, unwilling to accept this as a loss. He wasn't done yet. Todoroki held his forearms up in front of himself in defense and braced for another round. However, an attack never came. He felt himself be pulled from behind by Aizawa and watched Kosuke be pulled in the opposite direction by Ida and Kirishima, who had his arms hardened. "That bastard almost killed me. Think you could get away with that, rich kid?" He shouted, still flailing and trying to escape the grasp of his two strong classmates. "It's over. You'll get expelled at this rate." Ida tried to bring logic to the angry student. "Why you gotta do that, man? Heroes don't fight like that," Kirishima added as he hardened his cheek before Kosuke tried to claw at it. Todoroki only sat still on the floor in Aizawa's hold, not trying to continue this fight any further. He was going to be in so much trouble now. I'm sorry, he mumbled softly, looking down at the singed marks on his left hand. It was only a few moments before Kosuke was able to wriggle out of the grasp of his two classmates and made an attempt to charge at Todoroki again. You're clearly weaker than him. You're acting like a moron, a voice said tiredly, but it was close enough and loud enough to get the raging teenager's attention. What the hell did you dash? And then Kosuke froze mid-sentence. His eyes became foggy. His movements stopped fully. Sit down and shut up. Kosuke obediently sat down and shut up. Shinso stood in front of a small gaggle of students that had kept their distance from the recent fight but stayed close enough to watch. He sighed heavily when the rabid student was finally calmed by his quirk. He then turned his focus to Midoriya. Yamada had come with Aizawa and ran to Midoriya while Todoroki and Kosuke were being restrained. He knelt beside the teenager who was laying on the ground, holding his right eye with blood leaking from between his fingers and dripping onto the floor. Midoriya, hey, can you look at me? The teacher asked. He leaned over to try wrapping his arms around Midoriya's top half to get him off the floor. It was when Shinso finally calmed Kosuke that the purple-haired teenager, too, went over to the villain and got on his knees next to him, appearing to be very concerned for him. There was a lot of blood. Do you need anything? He asked, hoping that there was something more that he could do to help. Midoriya. Todoroki shook off Aizawa's grip that was nearly non-existent and finally went to his wounded friend, then looked to his right hand. He glanced at his teacher and then let his skin frost over and held Midoriya's right hand, hearing a quiet sizzling sound from his skin that made him whine in pain. I'm sorry. Todoroki apologized as he watched the freckled teenager still hide both his eyes, but could see his teeth gritting tight from the stinging pain of his burns being cooled. He put the top of Midoriya's hand against his forehead as he just held it and cooled it. It was all he could do. But hearing him in pain made him so upset. I'm sorry. Yamada kept Midoriya sitting up and kept his hands on his shoulders, watching Todoroki desperately try to ease the burns. He turned to Aizawa and hoped that both were thinking the same thing. I'll take him to Recovery Girl. I'll stay there while you speak to Principal Nizu, Todoroki said quietly, not breaking focus on his frost. Both teachers could already tell that Todoroki did not start this fight. I'll go with ya, kid. Shinso, think you could bring the other one? Yamada smiled kindly, keeping a calm demeanor for the students around him. His usual loud personality only made the soft side of him that much more comforting. Shinso nodded and got up, going to Kosuke and giving him brainwashed commands. All while Todoroki lifted Midoriya from the ground in a bridal-style fashion. He was a lot lighter this time than he was the first time he held him. But it was when he was lifted that Midoriya began to uncover his face, revealing the right side of his face to be bloody from a deep cut coming down his eye as it struggled to stay open. You okay, Todoroki? He asked softly with a worried expression. His hero could only bring himself to lightly nudge his forehead against his friend's and carried him to the nurse's office beside Yamada with Shinso and Kosuke trailing behind. He didn't want to answer. As they walked, Midoriya rested his head against Todoroki's chest while the pain was setting in from the adrenaline coming down. Yamada watched the two interact. The freckled teenager would occasionally reach up to hold his hero's cheek with one hand. In Recovery Girl's office, Todoroki would not leave his bedside while she cleaned him up and kissed away as much of the wound as she could. He cringed at every smooch but took it without a fuss. But he watched her face show a bit of worry. It's not going away, dear. She reached up, rubbed her thumb against the skin above his eye. I can take away the pain and bleeding, but I'm afraid that this will leave a nasty mark. Todoroki's heart shattered, looking to his friend on the bed who appeared to be sitting like a puppy. He tilted his head and tried to feel for the scar and felt a crooked line coming down his brow to just meeting some of his freckles. He didn't seem all that concerned, but his hero seemed to be heartbroken. His face had never shown so much hurt. And Midoriya noticed it and turned to him. In any other case, he would be angry and raging to get Kosuke expelled. Instead, he giggled and put his fingertip on the scar on his friend's face and giggled cutely. That's okay. Now we match. And it was then a small flame appeared on the red half of Todoroki's hair as well as a blush on his cheeks. Yamada watched from the doorway and couldn't help but smile watching them. It was then that his cell phone began to vibrate in his back pocket. Yamada walked out of the room to pick up the call with Recovery Girl following right behind, leaving the two students by themselves. Todoroki rested his head on Midoriya's bedside but proceeded to keep eye contact with him. "I'm sorry this happened," he mumbled. He couldn't help but feel so guilty about his friend getting hurt. But there was no way that Midoriya would blame him for anything. He was still sitting up with his legs angled towards each other, and he turned himself to put his hands on the bed in front of Todoroki's face. "It wasn't your fault. I acted on my own," he said desperately. "If anything, I'm sorry I escalated everything. Now you're bound to get in trouble and they're gonna tell your dad." He lowered his head, realizing what he just said was inevitable now. The school would have to call Endeavor. Todoroki would be in so much trouble. The color drained from his face, coming to terms of what he accidentally caused. "Your dad." "Todoroki, I'm so sorry." Todoroki shook his head slowly before blissfully shutting his eyes, tilting his head to get a better angle in his crossed-armed pillow. "Don't worry about it. It was inevitable. It was going to happen." He accepted it and simply wasn't going to worry about it yet. If you feel like something really bad is going to happen, please call me. I'll get you out of there, just trust me on that." Midoriya tried to salvage anything he could. He'd get Kurogiri to bring him somewhere safe and just have Todoroki close his eyes so he didn't see him. Following the conversation, there were a few moments of anxious silence. They were both thinking about what was going to happen when Todoroki got home. The possibilities were terrifying and making them both on edge. Midoriya didn't want to think about how much pain his hero would be put through. So he wanted to talk and think about something different. "Do you want to go somewhere this weekend?" he suddenly asked, trying to shift the atmosphere. Todoroki looked up at him, appearing to be slightly confused but still intrigued. "Like, just going somewhere fun? Just the two of us? He thought for a couple of seconds before balling his fists in front of him like a child. "Maybe an aquarium. There's one at the coast." He wanted him to say yes so badly. Basically just asked him on a date. Having realized that, his cheeks began to blush and his heart sped up exponentially. "I'd like that," Todoroki answered, looking up at his friend with a small glimmer in his eyes. It wasn't much later when Yamada and Aizawa would come into Recovery Girl's office followed by Principal Nizu. Though, it was more of Principal Nizu sitting on Aizawa's shoulder. The two students were silent when the adults came in and leaned against the wall. "Ida told me what happened," Aizawa began, making both the teenagers look to each other, and then they both looked down at their feet. How much trouble were they going to be in? If they got expelled? Shigaraki would be so angry and Endeavor would be furious. "Midoriya, I understand that you wanted to protect Todoroki, but you should not have hit Kosuka with your tray," Yamada lectured, rubbing the back of his neck. "But from what I've been told, Todoroki's been getting harassed by him in silence for a while now." So, it was clear he was holding back a smile as he turned away from Aizawa and made the smallest chuckle. "I can't bring myself to scold you. I would have probably done the same thing. You're in a hero school and you just wanted to protect your friend. And you were frustrated because clearly you dashed." He glanced at the two students and just had this feeling in his chest. He sighed softly and shrugged. "You care about him?" Aizawa looked very annoyed at Yamada but just sighed with a shrug. "You're too soft. Bet you'd let your students get away with murder?" Yamada looked dramatically offended and hurt, but it was obviously all an act. "They're kids. They're impulsive and full of passion and life." Midoriya smiled in relief watching his teacher stick up for him. Present Mike or Yamada Hisashi, he was someone that deserved to live a long life. If only he had met him sooner. Todoroki glanced at Midoriya and was relieved to know that he wouldn't get punished. But Aizawa was right. Yamada was very soft-hearted and a rule bender. His teacher may not be so easygoing. "Todoroki," Aizawa grumbled, closing his eyes and tilting his head. He looked annoyed. "All of this could have been avoided if you told me or All Might. Why didn't you?" Todoroki was so used to it. He was so accustomed to suffering in silence. Why didn't he ask for help? "I guess I didn't want to make it worse." He wasn't sure. Maybe it would have gotten worse. Maybe his classmates would think he was weak, Or maybe he didn't want his father to find out that he was being pushed around by some nobody. Maybe he didn't want to trouble his teachers. Kosuke had a broken nose, a concussion, second-degree burns, and a dislocated wrist. Recovery Girl was able to heal all of them, but you should not rely on her to make up for your outburst. Todoroki was sitting up straight in his chair, but he couldn't bring himself to make eye contact with Aizawa. Everything he was saying made sense to him, someone trying to be a hero. He felt ashamed. But Midoriya wouldn't stand for it. He was protecting me and Kosuke instigated it. You can't just dash. Aizawa raised his hand to silence Midoriya. The little villain just glared and gritted his teeth. You can't just blame Todoroki for everything. You don't know him like I do. Kosuke has been suspended until faculty decides whether he deserves to come back to a different class or to be expelled. Bullying and starting fights with students will not be tolerated. Principal Nizu finally spoke up, raising his two paws in the air. I hope you understand, Todoroki, that giving in to his taunts has put you in a sticky situation now. Use this as a learning experience. Ask for help next time something like this arises. The little mouse, dog, bear thing hopped off of Aizawa's shoulder and waddled up to the half-and-half hero, giving his knee a small pat. You're a very talented and smart young man. But I still need to run a school properly. So you'll be suspended for only the rest of the afternoon. Your father has been called to take you home. Even with Principal Nizu's cheery, supportive tone, his words made Todoroki's heart plummet to the bottom of his stomach. Much of the color drained from his face, but he tried to hide it. Midoriya saw right through it. They knew this was going to happen, but it was happening at this very moment, which made their anxiety worse. Why didn't they call his sister? He would have asked for Fuyumi instead of Endeavor. Todoroki rubbed the side of his head and lowered it so his eyes were covered by his hair from the teacher's perspective. Do you have any objections to that, Todoroki? Aizawa asked, gaining a glance from Yamada. No, sir, Todoroki answered quickly, but his voice had become so quiet all of a sudden. Then Principal Nizu looked to the tired teacher, stepping back and letting him come closer to the student. Is there something wrong? He asked, folding his hands in front of him. Ask for help. Ask him for help. Every part of him wanted to ask his teacher for help. That's what he was supposed to gain from this experience, wasn't he? No, it's fine. It's not fine. Nothing about this was fine, and Aizawa could tell. He wasn't going to give up, even if it meant putting him on the spot. Todoroki, why were there bandages on your neck on the first day of classes? Everyone's eyes except Principal Nizu's twitched wider at the blunt question. There was no avoiding the answer because Kosuke didn't know about Todoroki on the first day. Midoriya had hated Aizawa at the start of this talk, but now he could see exactly what he was doing, pushing Todoroki into a corner to try and get him to call out what was going on at home. He came off as harsh, but he couldn't tiptoe around an issue like this. Todoroki lifted his head quickly and finally looked at his teacher with little emotion to be deciphered, but behind his eyes, there was desperation. Tell him the truth. All he could suddenly think of was his mother's screams and crying. She had tried so hard to stop the abuse too. She threw herself in front of him. She tried telling her own family. She was only ridiculed and called a liar, forced to keep her sufferings internalized while no one believed her. She hurt so much because of him. Aizawa was stronger, but he still had things to lose. He couldn't let his reputation be stripped away because of him. A training accident at home. It was my fault, Todoroki answered quietly. Midoriya got hurt from trying to protect him from Kosuke. Anyone who's ever tried to help him has suffered at least a little bit. What if that was how his big brother died? It wasn't worth it. He wasn't worth the trouble. Aizawa could only stand there and take that answer. He didn't want to in the slightest. He knew something was wrong, but he could do something if Todoroki just opened up to him. He sighed and went back to lean against the wall and folded his arms. He wasn't going to let one failure stop him from getting to the bottom of this. Ahem, speaking of home. Yamada cleared his throat to gain some attention. Hey Midoriya, your mother called the school a little while ago. She says you haven't been home since school started. What's up with that? Now it was Midoriya's turn to have his heart stop. He loved his mother, but she was going to rat him out at this rate. She was just worried, of course, he understood that. But why didn't she call him instead? even Todoroki was looking at him confused. He was in for it later. I've been staying with some really close friends. One is like a big brother to me, and he's been providing for me and everything. He lives closer to the school too, so I don't need to take the train every day. It was all true. It just wasn't the whole truth. I didn't realize I haven't been home in so long. I'll stop by soon to tell her. Once again, Yamada had let Midoriya off the hook so easily. He only shrugged with a grin, accepting his answer even though Aizawa shot him a dirty look. He was far too soft on his students sometimes. But before he could protest, there was a knock on the door. It was then opened by All Might in his fake form with Endeavor beside him looking to be very aggravated. Todoroki narrowed his eyes in a defensive glare at his father while Midoriya gave a very dark look to All Might. He hadn't seen his former idol in person in such a long time, and here he was, as fake as ever. Not only that, but he was leading Todoroki's greatest threat right to him without a second thought. He awaited the day Shigaraki would get his hands around his throat. All Might noticed the looks he and the other hero were receiving, and it put him off guard immediately. Such hateful, scarred faces in teenagers so young. Your father has arrived, young Todoroki. I look forward to seeing you in class tomorrow, he said with a smile plastered on his face. He wanted to let his student know that he would be fully welcomed back the next day despite being in trouble now. Perhaps it was meant to be a small hint for Endeavor to understand that his son had not done anything unforgivable wrong. Just learn from this next time, young man. All Might added, which made Midoriya grip the bedding tightly. How dare he speak to his hero in such a way? He would just learn to not trust or believe in adults any more than he already did. And it was then that Todoroki left with Endeavor in silence with Midoriya and Aizawa staring at them until they were out of view. Yamada, who was the student with purple hair from earlier, the one who calmed Kosuke down. Aizawa then asked, leaving afterward with his fellow teachers and Principal Nizu. What the hell happened to your face? Shigaraki asked when Midoriya sat down at the bar next to him as soon as he returned from school. Is it gonna scar? Midoriya went ahead and explained all that had happened that afternoon to Kurogiri and Shigaraki while ignoring the afternoon snack that was prepared on the counter for him. He didn't feel like eating after such a stressful day. There were too many things running through his mind. I heard him say, or at least almost say, that he wanted to kill him. He was so angry, and I got a peek at his face. Midoriya soon held his own cheeks and sighed thinking about the look Todoroki had on his face while he was choking Kosuke on the floor. His face blushed and eyes sparkled thinking about how strong and beautiful he looked. It had been like watching a demon in hellfire. It truly was beautiful. He bottles up so much hatred. He holds it back because the world wants him to. But at that moment he let it slip. He was so beautiful, Tom. You don't understand. His passion to nearly kill someone was something else. He swayed lightly just thinking back on it. But he soon stopped when he banged his fists on the counter. But Endeavor had to come and take him away. I need to get him out of there soon. But how on earth was he going to do that? If he disappeared for more than a day, the number 2 hero would certainly go to the school to take him back again. He definitely wouldn't go without punishment. Just a question, Izuku, what kind of things does Todoroki like? Kurogiri asked, sliding a glass of water to the little villain. He wasn't eating, but he should at least stay hydrated. Traditional Japanese things. Shigaraki's eyes trailed from Midoriya to Kurogiri slowly before going back to Midoriya, watching him drink the water that he was just passed. It was like he was waiting for something, waiting for someone to say something. He saw Kurogiri was casually cleaning everything behind the counter again without adding any more to the conversation. Kurogiri is going to go away for a little while, Shigaraki said with an exhale, resting his cheek in his hand. Midoriya flinched, swallowed the water, and looked back and forth between the two. He's going to sneak into UA next week so we can get in and ambush All Might from the inside. Not too dangerous. He just won't be around to take care of you. So we're going in already? Is that a good idea? Midoriya asked. This all seemed a bit too soon. He hadn't studied the other students or Aizawa that much yet. His notes were vague on them. But Shigaraki seemed to be a bit eager and impatient to destroy the symbol of peace he hated so much. That's when the older villain stood up and gestured with his fingers for the younger to follow, which he did. Then the two of them would go into the elevator, leaving the dark fog father figure behind looking very suspicious to where they were going. It was then that Shigaraki would take Midoriya to a floor lower than his laboratory. "What's down there?" the little villain asked curiously. Shigaraki just smirked with a glint in his eye. "The fruits of your hard work." The room revealed was smaller than the laboratory and a lot darker. The floors and walls were metal and there were chains all around the room linking together to something in the center underneath the only white light. The sound of heavy deep breathing echoed off the walls, but it didn't sound like human breathing. It was something else. It's massive. Midoriya gazed up to the face of a monster sitting at the center of the room. Its neck, wrists, and ankles were chained to every corner to restrict any movement, although it was completely still. It was giant, twice the size of All Might, and appeared to have painfully bulging muscle. Its skin was a dark purple, stressed and bruised beyond healing. It had a beak rather than a mouth, eyes practically popping out of its head, brain exposed out of the skull for those around to see. An artificial human. A gnome, Shigaraki said, walking closer to it with his hands in his pockets. "Your research helped my master's Dr. Perfect the design and method for making the perfect killing machine. It's a subject injected with several different quirks, making it powerful beyond compare. He was having a problem for a while where the original body would just die from the intensity and become useless, making him start all over." Midoriya stared in awe of the beast that was sitting on the floor before him. "He helped make that?" A crooked smile twitched on his lips. "He helped make this monster. Its body was stable in containing so much visible power. The delicate process of easing quirks into a person without killing them sounded very difficult indeed. From the looks of it, the brain being exposed gave him the assumption that the strain of being pumped full of quirks blew its mental power out. It's brain dead. But the doctor was able to make it only obey specific voices." Shigaraki smiled at his little brother. "Mine and yours. It was a slave to them. It would listen to their voices and their voices alone. Any command would be followed suit if within the range of possibility. I also requested an extra component." Shigaraki strolled over towards the elevator where a small security code box sat on the wall. He did it slow enough for the little villain to catch the code 5651. Once it was inserted, all the chains released the Nomo, but it still sat still. Midoriya watched the chains fall, hearing the loud clanging of the heavy metal fall to the floor. Then Shigaraki pulled a small vial out of his pocket and inside was a simple mosquito. He released it and let it fly around for a few seconds, letting it buzz over to the little villain. Just before it landed on his hand, the Nomu had blasted right past him, sending a gust of wind behind so powerful that he dropped to his knee to keep from falling backward. Behind him, he saw the monster with its fist denting the wall with it cracked and cratering it from the strength in its punch. It punched the mosquito so hard that it broke the wall. "It'll protect you without hesitation." Midoriya was stunned with amazement over the creature. "Come here," he said, testing out what he had been told. He was thrilled when he slowly stood back up and saw the Nomu pull its fist back and then stomp over to him, towering him in height. "Sit," he watched it sit. Just as obedient as a dog, if not more so. "Give me your head." Midoriya reached up and watched the Nomu lower its head to be held by the little villain. It was then that he began to gently stroke its beak with a smile. The perfect killing machine, but also the perfect pet. No wonder Shigaraki wanted to attack All Might so soon. He had something that had to be more powerful than that hero was and, of course, he wanted to use it right away. It was perfect. Midoriya left the bar earlier than normal and rushing more than usual, only grabbing a piece of toast from a plate on the counter before running out the door. "Leaving early. Bye." He waved quickly to Shigaraki, who was going through a few folders worth of papers when he watched his little brother practically sprint out the door. He didn't question it. Somehow his backpack looked more stuffed than usual, but he didn't seem concerned about it. Midoriya tried to get to school before most of the other students that next day, not caring what anyone would say about the red jagged line down his eye. If Todoroki and Shigaraki could live with scars, then he could too. When he got to the campus, he would just pace around the classroom and lockers of Class 1A waiting anxiously for his friend to come around. Endeavor did not look happy yesterday, and he didn't even want to imagine what hell Todoroki was put through for getting involved in a fight. Would he even show up at all? What if something really bad happened to him? How bad would his burns be? Was he prepared to put a splint on a broken bone? He began scratching at his wrists as he paced around. Todoroki only got angry because of him. He was the reason he fought Kosuke. He was the reason for any injuries he would come back with this morning. How much pain did he face because of him? It wasn't much longer when Todoroki would be found at his locker, looking even more exhausted than he had the day before. Under his eyes were dark and his eyelids seemed to hang lower than usual. His hair was a bit messy with red and white strands poking out and mixing with the other color. He didn't sleep last night, but there were no bandages to be seen upon being discovered. Midoriya stood a small distance beside him and breathed a sigh of relief seeing that he wasn't hurt. His friend just looked desperate for a nap. "Todoroki, are you okay?" he asked, walking a bit closer. Todoroki blinked slowly and rubbed one eye with the back of his hand. Tired, he mumbled before opening his eyes again and looked down at his friend, remembering the scar he had on his face now. He suddenly looked so sad about it. "Are you feeling okay?" he asked back, looking directly at the red line coming down his friend's face with a soft tone. But Midoriya just smiled brightly for him, trying to wash away any of the guilt he felt. "I feel so much better seeing that you're not hurt." He would have been devastated otherwise. He gave his backpack a tug to pull it up on his back more, feeling it weighing him down a little bit because of how heavy it was. Packing extra medical supplies made it weigh a ton. "So what happened last night? You can't tell me that it was nothing," he then asked. Todoroki closed his locker and began to walk beside his friend, dragging his feet slightly. At one point, he closed his eyes and shook his head rapidly for a moment. "We argued. A lot. But he couldn't do anything because he had company over later. Lots of detectives have been coming over and relaying information on the sudden disappearance case and dropping off files for him and his agency to look over," Todoroki explained. Endeavor was really taking over the investigation of finding Midoriya's subjects and bringing him to justice. He felt so powerful hiding right under the flame hero's nose like this. "I was surprised that he let that stop him. But he knows I don't take his shit without a fight. It doesn't matter if he's stronger than me. So it's tonight that I'm more concerned about because it'll be just us until my sister, Fuyumi, gets home. She'll usually help calm him down." He then fell silent, letting his head drop and lift slightly with exhaustion. They must have argued all night and then he must have sat there in the paranoia of something happening while he was asleep. "Let's hang out after school. We should go to the park again until your sister gets home so you don't need to think about it as much," Midoriya offered. To which he received the answer of a nod, a small. The school began to fill up with more students as it got closer to homeroom period. Midoriya wanted to stay with his hero until the last possible moment, especially while he was so tired like this. While they walked, he occasionally tugged at Todoroki's arm to keep him from bumping into people and the corners of walls. It was within this bit of free time that Todoroki felt the presence much larger than him come around the corner in a fast manner. Their footsteps were heavy and the figure he saw from the corner of his eye was massive. "Young to-do dash." All Might's voice was as loud as ever, but it must have triggered something. Todoroki yanked Midoriya behind him as he raised his right arm suddenly and made a small, jagged ice wall between them and the pro-hero in sheer panic and on instinct. The move of self-defense stunned the pro-hero as he took a step back and looked at the frost that made its way onto his clothes. He frightened his own student? He was just trying to greet him. But upon taking another look at his student's face, he saw anger but also strained fear as he kept his pose from using his quirk, breathing heavily but steadily. This little stunt of his also gained the attention of many surrounding students, including a multitude of his classmates. Todoroki glanced around at them, realizing that he looked ridiculous for almost attacking his teacher. Midoriya held Todoroki's other arm gently, realizing the mental toll of the arguing with his father last night. He was left paranoid and exhausted enough to have his senses skewed. He melted the wall that was no taller than All Might quickly before walking away at a faster pace than before, his friends still holding on to him being more than aware that he was embarrassed and ashamed. It hurt to see his friend like this, living so miserably. How did he keep living like this? Midoriya walked Todoroki to class that morning and then went to class himself. He sat down at his desk and took out his school notebook when he just felt that he was being watched. When he looked up, he saw Shinso looking at him from halfway across the room, and when they finally made eye contact, the purple-haired student made a small wave with his cheek resting on his other fist. The villain waved back, remembering how his classmate was able to apprehend Kosuke and did his best to help him. Mutual respect was nice. Watching Todoroki during the observation period was painful. He was still one of the best in class, but his focus was non-existent. Midoriya felt his skin crawl when Ida tried talking to him any chance he had. There was a point towards the end where he almost tripped over a piece of debris from the results of their training, being too tired to focus on where he was walking. And Midoriya felt his nails digging into his wrists as he saw Ida dare put his hands around Todoroki's waist to catch him from behind. He listened to their mics over his headset begrudgingly. "Todoroki, please be a bit more careful. You've been uncharacteristically careless today," Ida said, carefully pulling him closer and upright so he wouldn't fall over. The taller student's eyes squinted when he let go but saw that Todoroki looked very pale with red around his cheeks. "Drink something too. You're getting dehydrated and it isn't safe to dash," he warned before going to grab him again because he was swaying a lot from dizziness. Midoriya wanted to claw at the skin on his face when he saw Ida hold Todoroki so close. He brought Todoroki up against him so the shorter student could rest his head on his chest as he reached into a pouch. From his armored costume, he took out a small flask of orange juice. "Here, try this." "Apologies that I drank half of it already." Ida held it up to him but didn't let go when Todoroki put his hand over his to put it to his lips and drink. With his face resting so delicately on his chest, drinking from the same flask as him, and holding his hand in this way, Midoriya was fuming. He was ready to call Shigaraki to kill Ida right where he stood when he took the flask back and wiped a drop of juice off of Todoroki's chin. Watching his hero stand there so tired and disoriented, eyes half-lidded and hardly able to stand up straight, and that four-eyed bastard being so willing to help him this way made him beyond furious. "I can see the stress is getting to you, although I doubt you're willing to talk about it." Between Kosuke, the scene with All Might that morning, and being suspended yesterday afternoon, Todoroki's mental and physical state was not unwarranted. Out of spite, during the lunch period, Midoriya refused to leave Todoroki's side. The moment Ida tried to make conversation with him, the little villain would talk over him just loud enough so only he could be heard. His tone would be overly sweet to make Todoroki feel more comforted. But in all honesty, the half-and-half hero was too tired to pay either of them and preferred just to eat peacefully for the first time in a while at UA. Kosuke was no longer here to harass him, and he could at least get peace of mind from that fact. "I should go see him." All Might sat at his desk when school was shutting down for the day with Aizawa and Yamada. The two heroes walked in together when they saw the number 1 pro having a small crisis at his desk. "What?" Aizawa asked, not quite understanding what All Might was talking about. He had his hands together at the bridge of his nose, eyes closed, and looked very conflicted. "Todor Endeavor. I think I should go see him." What Todoroki did that morning had not left him. The fear on his face, the exhaustion, his first instinct, his isolated nature, the bandages that had been mentioned just the day before, these all led up to a conclusion he didn't want to be true. "I want to check on young Todoroki. I've suddenly become worried about him, so I think I'll try to pay the family a visit tomorrow." Aizawa and Yamada looked at each other for a moment. "Let us and Nizu know if something is wrong the second something feels off," Aizawa instructed. It was then that Yamada looked out the window and smiled a little bit seeing Midoriya leave school with Todoroki, side by side. "You know, I think my student just may have a crush on him," he nearly giggled. "What do you think? You'd know about that kind of stuff, right?" He smirked at Aizawa, who lowered his face into his scarf, looking more irritated all of a sudden. But the tired teacher staggered over to the window to see the two students talking, though it was mostly Midoriya trying to keep a bright and cheery mood to keep his friend awake. Now that Yamada was mentioning it, the two seemed to spend every moment they could together. "However, I can't imagine Endeavor being happy about that," Aizawa grumbled. When at the park, at last, Midoriya sat down with Todoroki in the same spot as last time, underneath a tree in a subtle quiet bliss. Midoriya had been the one making conversation the whole way there, and now he felt his friend deserved some silence. If anything, this was an opportunity to get a little closer to him. But he couldn't keep himself from blushing madly and fidgeting with his hands as they sat there together. Just ask him. Just make the offer. It's not that hard. He was barely even conscious. Todoroki? If you just want to sleep, it's okay, he started. Why you can, there's probably bugs on the ground, so maybe this wasn't a good way to start. Todoroki was looking at him now with his eyes looking ready to close any moment. I really like you and I hate to see you suffering like this. You're so tired and you need to rest. So if you want him, he had his back against the tree and put his hands on his legs that were together in front of him. You can take a nap on me if you want. Todoroki tilted his head slightly but nodded his head slowly. Fyofer. I'd like that a lot, he mumbled. I want you to. Midoriya admitted, but it came out louder than he wanted and made him blush more. He held his own cheek and turned to look away, unable to bear making eye contact now. He probably seemed so strange now, and Todoroki would never want to talk to him ever again, and he probably just ruined any opportunity of normal conversation, and he felt a weight on his thighs. He looked down and saw Todoroki resting his head on his lap, shifting around to find the perfect position to get comfortable. Midoriya stayed stiff, letting him turn and move around on his legs. When he finally stopped moving, the little villain looked down to find him instantly asleep. To watch him fall unconscious so quickly surprised him, but he now felt that he held a powerful force right on his lap. A murderer, someone who has experimented on someone alive, someone who had dissected corpses without flinching, someone who had become so ruthless in these past months now had the most precious thing in his life blissfully sleeping in his lap. His hand had been soaked with blood that was not his own, and now they caressed the silky, soft hair of someone so beautiful, running his fingers through white strands of purity. He's heard the cries of pain and screams of agony, and now he was blessed with the sounds of soft, perfect breathing. He's seen the most gruesome sights, organs and bones, corpses and carcasses, and here was, watching the most beautiful person cry the most delicate and gentle tears. He could see teardrops escape Todoroki's eye, twinkling at the perfect angle of the sun's rays of light through the leaves in the tree above them. The person he loved most was suffering so much, in so much pain all the time. All he could do now was stroke his hair and wipe his tears away, caring for him in his vulnerable state. The purest soul, a living angel, resting in the arms of a monster and being petted by a demon. He'd do anything for him. He'd do everything for him, to take all his pain away. As a doctor, he should be able to do that, and yet this was a pain he could not heal with bandages and medicines. Todoroki, he whispered softly, stroking his white hair to the side and exposing his pale cheek. There was no flinch or response from his hero that was completely submerged into exhaustion. I wish I could just tell you. He brushed his thumb against Todoroki's parted lips. How much I really love you. He could only bring himself to kiss his cheek and return to petting his hair soothingly. Both of Midoriya's legs had long gone numb by the time Todoroki began to shift again. The sun was setting with the sky a mix of oranges, reds, yellows, pinks, and purples. But nothing was as beautiful as the red and white mess on his lap. He watched his eyes tighten and then slowly pry themselves open, looking straight ahead at the playground before them, then moving to focus on the smiling freckled face above him. Sleep well? Midoriya asked, running his hand through his beloved's hair to move it out of his face to see his cutely sleepy complexion. Yeah, it was nice. Todoroki breathed quietly. He went to try and sit up but gave up after he could barely lift his head an inch. Instead, he turned himself on his side to face the villain's stomach. He wasn't ready to get up yet. Every time I'm with you it's nice, he added shamelessly. It's easy to forget everything else with you. Hearing that made Midoriya's heart grow wings and fly far beyond the atmosphere. We should go to that aquarium tomorrow then. We can go early and stay out almost all day so you don't have to be home. That sounds good, right? A date. Let this be a date. Midoriya wanted this to be a date more than anything. I'd like that. We should do that. Todoroki agreed and finally lifted his head to get on his hands and knees, facing the little villain. We should come here every day after school too. I don't care what the old man says anymore, Endeavor would be too busy with the investigation from now on anyway. Wouldn't it be nice for him to be so busy that he forgot that he even had a son? Then we should. Midoriya was more than happy to agree and raised his hands to start organizing Todoroki's hair to be parted properly. He watched his hero close his eyes while he did so. If only he had the courage to tell him how pretty he thought he was. The two of them sat together, side by side underneath the tree in the park. Midoriya would talk about class and eventually his big brother and father. Yamada had broken his secret that he hasn't been to his mother's house in a very long time, so he may as well take the time to explain where he has been to not make anything suspicious. My big brother is really introverted. He never goes out. But he's the one that introduced me into medical stuff and gave me a head start on it. It's thanks to him that I got into UA in the first place. But he's not really mature and boring or anything like that. He's really fun and we like to tease each other. And my dad, well, he's not really my dad. He held up a finger with a smile and shrugged. I never knew my real dad. But this guy is seriously awesome. He helped settle down at their place and gave me a space of my own to live in. He cooks and cleans and helps me study. You'd really like him. Midoriya would go on being bubbly and talkative about his makeshift family while Todoroki just listened. He loved to listen to him. Hearing about his family made him start to imagine what it would be like if he had something like that. This would continue until the sun had gone down completely, to which the two would part ways to go home. Midoriya did take a second to stop and look back at his hero for a few moments. They'd see each other tomorrow morning, but it still hurt to be away from him. He wanted to do something for him, and he wanted to do it now, and he knew just what he wanted to do. He began to run home with his phone in his hand, texting Kurogyari and Shigaraki quickly with a glow that began to reappear in his eyes. He couldn't kill someone as powerful as Endeavor, but there was someone else he could take away. He couldn't help but smile thinking about it. Meanwhile, while Todoroki was walking back, he heard a strange sound from an alleyway along his path. Upon Midoriya arriving back at the hideout, Kurogyari and Shigaraki were both at the bar as usual. Though Shigaraki wore a hoodie which he didn't usually wear indoors. He must have just gotten back from somewhere. Did you get him already? Midoriya asked, placing his bag down at his usual stool. Your notebook has the most details on him. And with his name, it was easy to get in and out of the school database without getting caught. Shigaraki took a small bite of a cookie in his hand and was scrolling through his phone. For a hermit who was always on some electronic, he was quite the computer whiz. He's from the poorest side of the city, so no one will notice that he's gone for a while. Did you have something in mind with him either? The older villain asked, though it seems that he didn't mind what the answer may be. He was just curious. But Midoriya just shrugged. There was no solid plan besides kill him. I wouldn't mind displaying his body as a warning to the school. Have the media get a hold of the news and let the whole world know. Shigaraki snickered. Kurogyari shook his head with his arms folded. Anything for attention with you. Although the idea would coincide with our plans already in place. Midoriya thought about his villain costume that he had received. He hasn't had a chance to wear it yet. But he also has never had a villain name to show off yet either. Would this be an opportunity to get his name out into the world? Hey, if Call Myself Fallen, could we let them know that I did it? He asked, looking to his big brother. Fallen? Is that what you want your villain name to be? Why something like that? Because I almost fell off a roof when Todoroki found me and stopped me. Even though I didn't fall from the roof, I did fall from the rest of society. He stopped worshipping heroes and fell out of the norm. He fell off All Might's radar. His hopes fell. His dreams fell. He wanted to fall off the roof. But now he was more of a fallen angel that turned into the devil if the red glow he had in his eyes was any indication of that. Go for it then. Shigaraki waved him off but had a wide grin on his face. Let his doctor make a name for himself. So with his permission and approval, Midoriya took the stairs straight to his room and got changed. Eat something first, Izuku. Kurogyari called out, but the boy was long gone and too motivated to turn around. Usually, he would get into all black clothing, but now he wanted to wear something else. Something he hasn't been able to try on yet. And then he went to the elevator to go down to his laboratory. The ride down felt longer than normal, but Midoriya blamed it on his nerves. He was twitching with anticipation. Why hadn't he done this earlier? It would have been too suspicious if a student didn't show up to class, but now that his new plaything was suspended he could be kept down here for the whole weekend and longer. As soon as the elevator doors opened, he was reminded by how dark his laboratory was without the lights on. But the light from the elevator was enough to make someone stir. "Who is that? Get me out of here," shouted a familiar voice, one that Midoriya would love to never hear again. He heard chains rattling and metal banging as his subject thrashed about the cage he was in. Kosuke sat in a cage with hands and feet chained to the bars to restrict his movements, and a specifically made mask was around his mouth to prevent him from breathing flames. And yet he still struggled to break free, though he froze when he heard footsteps begin to approach the cage. "Who the hell?" he growled at the short teenager in a dress vest and tie, dress shoes and pants, with black gloves on his hands and a terrifying smiling mask over his mouth. But the little villain didn't wear the face mask to hide his nose, cheeks, and eyes. With just glowing red eyes alone, anyone could tell that he was smiling with a tilt of his head. "You have no idea how long I've waited to see you like this," he giggled. Kosuke stared up at the villain outside and standing over the cage. "You're that," he began, watching Midoriya tilt his head in the opposite direction. His scarred eye seemed brighter than the other. He was ecstatic to see the fire breather for once. "You're that guy that hangs around Todoroki, aren't you?" He appeared frightened at first but then became very angry. "What the hell is this? Some prank? Get your ass in here and fight me fair and square." He began thrashing again and tried to breathe a flame. But the mask contained it and he winced at the pain of burning his own mouth. This childish tantrum destroyed the little villain's cheery attitude and he suddenly appeared annoyed and frustrated. "You're so noisy," he grumbled, kneeling down to the cage's level, pulling his mask down. "I'll make you regret every time you even looked at Todoroki." The thrashing stopped but Kosuke still tugged his hand to try and pull it out of the chain. "What the hell is this? Don't tell me this is about him." He had so many questions. Where was he? Was this even real? This had to be a complicated joke. A prank of revenge for getting into that fight. There's no way that someone in UA would chain him up and put him in a cage like an animal. Everything is about him. Midoriya breathed, his smile slowly coming back in a crooked grin as he lowered the voice-mixing mask. Of course this is all for him. Finally, he would get to kill this brat that made Todoroki so miserable. His eyes were wide with anticipation. He wanted to be covered in his blood. He wanted to hear his screams. He wanted to see his insides and study his corpse as nothing more than a corpse. "What the hell?" It was all Kosuke could say. He was staring in the eyes of a monster. He watched that monster get up and go to his desk to pick up a notebook and pen. He took the cap off with his teeth and held it there. "Your parents have quirks?" "What? Do mommy and daddy have quirks?" Midoriya narrowed his eyes at Kosuke, waiting for an answer. He kicked the cage after the silence lasted a few seconds too long. In an attempt to be smart, the fire breather decided to play along to try and live a little longer, long enough for help to come. "My dad has a dragon quirk. Scales, fire breathing, big claws, he has a tail too. My mom..." He clicked his teeth. "Lame. She's quirkless?" Midoriya wrote down his answers and then began taking more notes. "Feel like her being quirkless kept you from having a flashy quirk like your father?" "Yeah, so what? Sucks to suck. Fuck you." Midoriya kicked the cage again. "What happens when you overuse your quirk?" "It gets hard to breathe. One time I burnt my lungs." "What happened that one time?" "Burned down a bunch of rich people's homes in one night when I was little. Some fuckers that fucked over my dad. I stopped breathing and everything tasted like smoke." Midoriya continued to write. It sounded like a poor kid with a grudge against the rich. Todoroki being a part of a wealthy family must have pissed him off. But he seemed to have a healthy family relationship except for some rebellion against his mom. What Todoroki would probably give to switch lives. "What about Dash?" Midoriya was about to ask another question when his phone in his back pocket vibrated. He put his notebook and pen down and saw that it was his beloved that texted him, a picture too. He was home in a fancy bathroom covered in spots of mud with a small dog in front of him. "Todoroki, I found a dog." Midoriya, "You found a dog?" "Todoroki, she was hurt and I found her on the way home." Her presence would piss the old man off. Midoriya, so you brought her home? Todoroki, yes. He's so perfect. In every way. Midoriya swooned. His subtle pettiness against his father was something he was finding cute, and his undying kindness for anyone in pain was beyond gorgeous. I love him, he hummed, hugging his phone and swaying side to side. You're crazy, Kosuke commented from inside the cage. Have you killed people? He then asked, trying to see through some of the remaining darkness in the laboratory. A couple, the villain answered, which caused the hero student to scoff. You give people like you a bad name. Giving homosexual individuals a bad name by being a villain, driven mad with romantic desires for a hero and revenge against others. You don't know anything about me. And don't act like you know Todoroki either. So are you going to kill me or what? Midoriya looked at Kosuke when he asked that question. He was just being glared at, but Kosuke was holding his ground and putting on a fearless front despite his position. Suddenly, I don't feel like it. I'll do it later. Midoriya put his notebook and pen back on his desk and closed it, going back to the elevator instead. He didn't feel like killing him. But he was here. He could save him for at least a little while and get as much out of him as he could. I'm going to bed instead. I have something important tomorrow. Todoroki was the only thing on his mind. He couldn't risk being tired for their little date tomorrow. Kosuke's fate would simply be put on hold until he had found a good time to get to work. Midoriya spent a solid 30 minutes looking through all his clothes for a decent outfit that did not consist of all black. He was really taking after Shigaraki in the fashion department and was grumbling to himself as he kept digging. He eventually settled on a green jacket with a white and green checkered shirt and jeans. It's the lightest outfit he had. He couldn't have Todoroki see him try to be edgy in all black. He'd look ridiculous. Once he was dressed and washed up, he ran down the stairs and grabbed a single donut that was on the counter and went right past Shigaraki. And where are you going on the weekend? His big brother asked, playing video games without looking at the screen. Todoroki and I are going out. I'll be back before dark, promise? Is this a date with your little Prince Charming? Shigaraki smirked and Midoriya went red. There was no denying it now. But he didn't know if this was considered a date himself. He bit the inside of his cheek and looked away, all flustered, thinking about how to answer. Maybe, he muttered. Then go have fun. The older villain replied back instantly. No teasing, no subtle meaning, no sarcasm, no joking. His big brother just wanted him to have a fun time. I will, and the smaller villain was out the door in a heartbeat, racing to the aquarium to meet his beautiful hero there. He had the best big brother and he hoped Todoroki did too. Standing on a cobblestone walkway just outside the aquarium, Midoriya spotted his beloved checking his phone, likely checking to see if he missed any messages. He appeared to be by himself until he noticed a white leash stemming from messenger bag that he had, with a small to medium-sized dog attached to it. Midoriya was nearly stunned with a smile and sheer shock. He kept it. He kept the dog he found on the streets, and he probably did it out of pure spite. He would have been more concerned, but then he saw him crouch down to pet it, and it earned him a puppy kiss to his scarred cheek that made him make a half smile. He deserved an emotional support animal, so what was the harm? Good morning, Midoriya greeted with a warm smile. Todoroki looked up from his new friend and stood up straight, appearing to be much more well-rested and awake today than he was yesterday. Good morning to you too, he said back and then turned his head down to the dog standing between them. This is Zuzu. Midoriya froze and blanked out for a moment, having a pretty strong theory as to where that name came from. Midoriya Izuku. Izuku. Zuzu. He wanted to cry from it being very adorable but also very embarrassing. Good morning, Zuzu. He exhaled, not sure how to feel about this name. But he'll just have to live with it. Did Endeavor find her? Todoroki nodded. He heard me giving her a bath. But Fuyumi insisted that he let me keep her. She won the argument for him. Todoroki had it. Midoriya had a Nomo. Walking up to the ticket counter, Midoriya began to dig through his wallet when Todoroki put his hand over it and held up a piece of plastic instead. He was too young for a credit card. That credit card most definitely said Todoroki Enji. You stole that, didn't you? Midoriya smirked. I at least remember one thing from my eldest brother. Todoroki commented, preparing to hand the card over to the lady behind the counter. He noticed on the glass that there was a kind of discount day where couples were getting in half off. He didn't pay it much mind, however. He received a receipt and was about to throw it away when Midoriya grabbed it, curious to see how much it costs to get in. It's a lot cheaper than I thought. You sure this was for 2 tickets? The paper said 2 tickets and they were holding 2 tickets, and yet the price seemed like a steal. And that's when he noticed that there were a bunch of couples around holding hands and being romantic and cute together. That's when the little villain noticed some of the advertisements and went bright red. The ticket lady gave them the discount because she thought that they were dating. How embarrassing. I don't know. I've never been to one of these before. Todoroki shrugged. Midoriya looked to Todoroki, who seemed very confused by his surroundings when they finally went inside to see the tanks. He's never been to an aquarium before? Never. Midoriya had to clarify. But if the expression he saw was any indication, his hero was not exaggerating. He watched him become nearly hypnotized by the sea creatures in tanks around him. The villain was falling in love with that side of him. The part of him where he becomes so interested in something that he just stares at it and disassociates. He found it almost cute, but more childishly innocent. He had come to realize that his hero knew very little about the pleasures of the world around himself, but he was more than willing to learn about it all. He was just curious. Here, I really like looking at the sharks. Midoriya strolled up beside Todoroki, giving Zuzu a quick pet on the head and then subtly took hold of his hero's hand and pointed to the direction that he wanted to go. No one questioned the dog that was following beside them on the leash. And this was how their trip would go for quite some time. Midoriya would guide his hero around the things he liked, letting him stare at them for as long as he wanted to. There was one area where it was a tunnel and all that surrounded them except the floor were tanks with animals in them. The light from the tanks, moving from the water and evening out through the glass, made it all feel otherworldly to him. The villain preferred looking at his hero, loving nothing more than seeing him be so fascinated and so at peace. He wanted to see him like this all the time. He just seemed so happy. And when he wasn't paying attention to any of his surroundings, Midoriya just barely squeezed his hand with his cheeks lightly dusted pink. He liked how soft his hands were, likely having his quirk burn away any dry or dead skin. Was the rest of him like that? Midoriya's face became blood red when that question surfaced and tried to keep himself cool. But now that he was telling himself to stop thinking about it, now he couldn't stop thinking about it. His hands were so soft and his cheek was too. He kissed him while he was asleep yesterday, but it was because he was too shy to do anything more. But was the rest of him that soft? He was so strong, he knew that. His refined muscle was impressive for someone his age, but that was likely due to how grueling and abusive hero training was. Midoriya didn't even notice himself looking him up and down now. His face was always beautiful to him. From the day they first met, he's believed that. But seeing him dressed casually in a dark blue jacket and a white shirt, as plain as it was, he never noticed how attractive he was altogether. But he had to stop thinking about that. That wasn't right. That kind of stuff was too old for him. But he couldn't stop. Now he was curious too. How did he get so lucky to be so close to such a beautiful person such as this? At one point, the two teenagers sat down on a bench with Zuzu getting comfortable on Todoroki's lap, happily receiving pets from both of them. So what other kinds of places have you never been to? Now I want to take you everywhere to see you like this. Midoriya giggled. Like what? Todoroki tilted his head. Like that? You loosen up a lot when we're not at school. You're calmer and you're really observant of everything around you. You don't look so stressed out. The villain smiled cheerfully, watching his hero think about what he said. He seemed pretty confused at first but just accepted it. Between Kosuka and Endeavor, you're the only one I like being with. Between school and home, the freckled teenager was the only he took comfort from. You always make me feel a little better. He was like a medicine. You make all my wounds less painful, a painkiller. I feel comfortable talking to you, an antidepressant. It just feels safer. He was a drug. Todoroki turned to look at him with a look in his bicolored eyes that had never been seen before. They were struck with intensity but also a kind of affection that was innocent but much more powerful. Just you, just him alone. Just me, huh? Midoriya asked, scratching his cheek with one finger. Not Ida? Not Aizawa? Not even his own sister? He felt so honored and so special, smiling to himself. Was the hero that he was obsessed with now obsessed with him too? Well, I'm glad. He made a toothy grin disguising the biggest smile he would make. How he would love to say that all you need is me. They would spend the remainder of their afternoon in the aquarium, Midoriya taking Todoroki to touch tanks to be able to pet sharks and rays, taking him to little shows for seals and penguins, and showing him everything there was to show. He wanted to show him the world he's never gotten to see, being locked in his house for so long and seeing very little of life's pleasures. Midoriya almost took all of this away from himself all those months ago. He would never be able to have the joy of playing games with Shigaraki, going out with Todoroki, living a new dream, and making a new family. He was given the chance to live a new best life, and he wanted to give it all to his hero that gave him that chance. Watching him be in such a calm state of fascination and curiosity made him feel a satisfaction like no other. But eventually, they would leave the aquarium, seeing everything there was to see. It had to be late afternoon by now, but the sun was still high and there was still so much time left in the day. We should go to the mall. Have you been there before? Midoriya suggested, taking Todoroki's hand and giving him a small tug to direct him a different way on the sidewalk they were on. The hero student followed suit. Not in a long time. Sometimes the housemaid would take me to one store for new clothes, but I've never been to the rest of it. A second date on the same day. The little villain couldn't ask for anything more. We should go now then, and... He was so excited to go, but then his voice started to trail off. Todoroki saw it coming. Midoriya's eyes lost a lot of color and brightness to them suddenly, and the grip on his hand became much weaker. And he still wanted to speak. He began to take a few steps, but they appeared to be heavy and wobbly. His body began to tremble as he forced himself to walk, appearing to be exhausted all of a sudden. It was only a few moments when he began to collapse but was caught by his beloved who held him carefully upright. He felt so much lighter, so much skinnier than he had all those months ago. Did you eat anything today? Or yesterday? Todoroki asked quietly but with a strong intensity in his tone, Zuzu taking a few steps back to give him room to keep the freckled villain on his feet. I missed dinner on accident, and I ate half a donut this morning. Not enough. That was not enough to keep a growing teenage boy functioning. Todoroki's eyes narrowed but swiftly maneuvered him to rest on his back with his hands holding him up from under his knees. Where's the nearest place to get something to eat? Todoroki turned his head slightly to look to his friend who was halfway to falling asleep on his back. Exhaustion from lack of sleep and starvation exhaustion were two different kinds of exhaustion. But with those dark circles around his eyes, Midoriya had both and his body was not happy about it. You don't need to carry me, he mumbled, placing his hands on his shoulders. He was very strong. Don't worry about that. He loved him like this. So caring, concerned, responsible. It made him smile and nuzzle his cheek into the back of his neck. You're such a kind person, Todoroki. He smiled peacefully. Too kind, you know? He felt his left shoulder get much warmer than the other. He thought it was cute. Without an answer, Todoroki began to walk around the city carrying Midoriya on his back, searching for a place that could give a decent-sized meal with lots of protein in a timely manner. He eventually realized something. Oh, I know this area, he said out loud and turned a corner sharply, now having a sense of direction. It confused the villain on his back. Why did he know this area all of a sudden? It didn't look like anything special. Midoriya tried glancing around tiredly to see if he could get any clues from the surrounding area. It didn't seem all that different from other parts of the city. There was a skyscraper that looked a bit fancier than the others in the district that caught his eye. He was a rich kid, so maybe that had something to do. And that's when Midoriya's eyes widened in adrenaline-based panic. Todoroki, maybe we shouldn't be here, Shouldo? Todoroki suddenly stopped and took a few steps back. Zuzu stopped and her fur began to stand on the back of her neck as her tail began to straighten out, raising her lips slightly. Endeavor stood before them, towering over the two teenagers and blocking their path completely. That building was Endeavor's agency. This was his patrolling sector. They got caught in his territory and it looked like Todoroki was going to be in trouble. Why are you out? You were instructed to stay home to study, the pro growled, narrowing his eyes at him. Todoroki wasn't supposed to go out? He snuck out. He snuck out of the house and disobeyed his father just to go out with his friend. He was in trouble and Midoriya was powerless, being too weak to even stand. Todoroki wouldn't be able to outrun him with him on his back. All the villain could think to do was take out his phone and send a short text to the only person he could think of. "I'm so sorry, Todoroki," he whispered quietly for only his hero to hear. This was all his fault. Endeavor tried to take a step forward but Todoroki took a step back, glaring directly at him and not breaking eye contact. Were they going to fight in public? My friend needed my help. Can't you see that? I'm trying to help him, so get out of my way. Todoroki said with a sharp tone. Let him be a hero. That's what he wanted to be. That's nonsense. You don't have time for friends. Are you trying to lose sight of your destiny, Shudo? You mustn't be wasting your time like this. I'll take him. Endeavor went to reach forward to try and offer his hand to Midoriya, but the little villain hugged onto Todoroki's neck tightly. There was no way that he was going to be helped by Endeavor. Shudo, Endeavor became more irritated at Midoriya's reaction. Any kid would love to be saved by a pro as popular as him. What had he told him? Todoroki took a few more steps back as Zuzu's growling got louder, feeling the tension get heavier and hotter. We're going to have a long talk at home if you don't. Todoroki's right side began to frost over in self-defense as Endeavor tried to close the distance between them. He wasn't going to play this game. Midoriya shut his eyes tightly, just wanting to get away from this and take his beloved back to the aquarium, back to the park, back anywhere but here. Whoa, hey, there you are. Midoriya's eyes widened at the sound of a very familiar voice. Shigaraki casually walked up to the three with a hoodie on and without the hand on his face. He had a big fake smile plastered on and held his hands up like he was trying to keep the peace. Hope my little brother wasn't causing too much trouble. I've been looking for him all day. Midoriya looked terrified to see him out like this. His identity, his face was right in front of the pro that was in charge of finding them and arresting them. Why did he come out like this and not Kurogiri? Todoroki looked confused when the older villain approached him, turning to Midoriya to get some kind of approval from him. Big brother, the little villain mumbled. Shigaraki got up close to Todoroki, wrapping his arms around his little villain's torso to pull him off his back and then take him on his own. With a small toss-up, Midoriya was safely transitioned onto the older villain's back. Call him later, Shigaraki was just able to whisper into Todoroki's ear before backing away and grinning widely. Please forgive him, he's very adventurous. He gets lost easily but his stamina can't keep up, isn't that right? He bounced the freckled boy on his back, making him grumble and bury his face into the back of his hoodie. He was getting so dizzy now and it was hard to keep his eyes opened. He needed to get away from here quickly. Try to keep a better eye on him. Kids these days are always getting into trouble. Endeavor told Shigaraki before reaching over and grabbing Todoroki's wrist while he was too busy watching Midoriya. He yanked his son over to him and Midoriya was able to see his hand getting stressed from the strength of his grip. He struggled to grab his father's wrist to try making him loosen his hold, but Endeavor's power far outmatched him in terms of just physical ability. Zuzu noticed his struggling and began to whine, seeing her owner in pain. I think they can learn more by being a bit adventurous. Shigaraki hummed, still smiling and then knocking his head back to lightly bonk Midoriya. Like not going out without eating or drinking anything. The size of his smile and the extended time he was smiling was starting to scare the little villain. His smile was so big that his eyes were closed. Did he not want to even look at Endeavor? You trust too easily. You make it easy for them to disrespect you. Endeavor was about to go on a full debate with a mass killer about parenting while his son tried to frost his arm, but his father's heat prevented it from doing anything. And Shigaraki was too stubborn to walk away just yet. They disrespect you when you disrespect them. You should try being a bit more supportive because they'll listen better. Midoriya could see his smile twitching. He was breaking. But he wasn't. Opening his eyes. They don't understand what's best for them. It's a parent's job to tell them and guide them to what's best. Endeavor stated. Midoriya began to tug on Shigaraki's sleeve. He was going to snap at this rate and ruin all the plans they've come up with about surprise attacks. And there's no way he could beat someone twice his body mass like this. I don't think anyone should be forcing anyone to do something they don't want to do. Things are done best when they're done willingly. His red eyes peeked opened and there was only hatred and a lust for homicide staring straight at Endeavor, although it felt like he was looking at someone else. Someone familiar, but he couldn't make out a face. The people who want the most control tend to lose the most control in the end. Then he giggled and lowered his head, placing his own hand on his face except for his pinky finger. But what do I know? I'm not a parent. Later, stranger. And he turned around and began to walk away with his little brother looking back at Todoroki longingly. Todoroki stared right back at him for a moment before glaring up at his father and being dragged elsewhere. That bastard is going to die, Shigaraki said quietly, turning into an alleyway where a portal was awaiting him and sent them back to Kojiri's bar. He placed Midoriya on the sofa where the boy would soon fall over on his side and lay silently in a daze. Todoroki, Midoriya mumbled sadly. I left him, he had to go back. He had to go get him. He couldn't leave him with Endeavor after what just happened. Kurogiri came over and lifted Midoriya's head to help him drink a kind of fruit juice and then gave him a full plate of meat and vegetables to eat. Eat at least half of this and then we'll talk, he ordered. Without a complaint, the little villain began to eat slowly with chopsticks, thinking hard about what just took place. It was all his fault. Shigaraki had to show his face. Todoroki got in serious trouble. Endeavor knows who he was now. So much had been put at risk just now because he was stupid enough to succumb to exhaustion like this. The morning had gone so well. Todoroki was so happy earlier. Now all of that was ruined. He wanted to apologize for causing so much trouble, looking to Shigaraki who sat at the bar, angrily going through folders and scattering papers everywhere. Save it, he replied sharply. He must have been so mad at him. And yet, I hate people like him. Especially people like him. He makes me so mad. I should have turned him to ash right there. Midoriya listened and was nearly stunned by where his anger was being directed. That bastard. That piece of shit. I'll fucking kill him myself. And I'll find his fucking son and show him how much he's messed up. He was more determined than ever to take down the number 2 hero now. He'll regret the day he decided to be a damned father. He threw a folder across the room and slammed a single piece of paper on the counter with his fist. I'll find him. On the paper was a picture sitting on a shrine of a boy in a middle school uniform with white spiky hair and bright blue eyes. He had a soft face like Todoroki. He was more motivated than ever to find his missing Todoroki. For a little while, Kurogiri would gather the papers Shigaraki had thrown in his temper tantrum while Shigaraki put them in an order that he preferred. Midoriya sat on the sofa pacing his eating on the full meal in front of him. Most of his energy had returned but Kurogiri was determined to have him finish at least half before he was allowed to get up. It would take some time, but he would eat a little more than half before his phone went off. It was a phone call. He never got phone calls from anyone other than his mother, so his anxiety spiked as he was looking at the caller ID. Shigaraki turned back to see what his little brother was doing. Who is it? He asked. It's Todoroki. Midoriya was about to answer it when Shigaraki gestured him to come to the bar. Put it on the counter and put it on speaker, and the little killer did just that. Hello? Todoroki? Hello, he answered, but there was no response. To do dash, Shigaraki held a finger to his lips, signaling him to be quiet. That's when he took his own phone out and placed it beside the other, recording all the audio it was about to pick up. It was between Endeavor and Todoroki's voices. Todoroki must have called but did it in secret, just as Shigaraki told him. The little debate he had with his father must have gained a bit of his trust. Did he plan for that? Where did you go today? You don't need to know, it's not important. Answer me, Shuto. This rebellious phase is getting out of hand if you're starting to sneak out like this. I just wanted to get out. You never let me go anywhere. I keep you here to keep you focused. I won't let you get distracted at such a significant point in your growth. Stop talking to me like I'm something. I'm not your masterpiece. Why can't you just drop that stupid ideology? Can't you see I'm just trying to give you the best future? There was the sound of a fist slamming down on a table. Their voices were beginning to get louder. I won't let you be a failure like your siblings. There was a bit of shuffling. Todoroki probably stood up. They're not failures. Stop calling them that and say their names. There was a sound of something falling over and it made Midoriya's heart begin to race. Is this how Todoroki gets hurt at home, trying to defend himself from an overbearing parent? He tries to argue to defend his siblings' honor and try to remind Endeavor that he's a human and not a machine to build to perfection. Todoroki, Midoriya whispered, scratching at his wrists. This was his fault. Why is it so hard for you to just listen, Shudo? There were sounds of struggling. Why can't you just be a good parent like Todoroki was cut off, and that's when Midoriya had to cover his ears. He shut his eyes and held back tears as he listened to the one he loved more than anyone be beaten. They kept yelling at each other the whole time. He could tell Todoroki was trying to fight back as he could hear the effects of objects in the room freezing. But the ice was no match for a pro's fire and his flames were nowhere near powerful enough to overtake the others. And yet he still tried. He never gave in. There was crashing, banging, ripping, burning, but what hurt more than anything was to hear Todoroki make grunts and groans of pain. This went on for minutes. Minutes longer than Midoriya would have liked. Why did his hero, so kind and beautiful, have to go through such pain like this? He didn't deserve any of it. Tell me where you went, Shudo, and tell me who that boy was? Endeavor growled quietly. The room had gone silent now. There was deep breathing coming from the pro, but nothing could be heard from the other for at least a few seconds. None of your bebezine dashed. Todoroki's voice sounded so strained when he finally spoke, but he immediately got cut off. He didn't make another sound. All was quiet until there was a door opening and closing. Endeavor must have walked out. Todoroki? Todoroki? Midoriya took his phone in his hands and began shouting, praying that he would get an answer. There was none. Todoroki, please answer. Tell me you're okay, please. His hands were shaking as he brought his phone to the bridge of his nose and gritted his teeth. Shudo, are you there? There was no way he was dead. There was no possible way that his own father killed him. But didn't he supposedly kill his oldest brother? That couldn't be true. Even the number 2 hero wouldn't be able to get away with that. Say something for fuck's sake. His hero couldn't be dead. It was then that he heard something shift. There was some fumbling that the mic was picking up. There was the sound of a door slowly being pushed open just a little bit. There was the sound of a dog whining, a small bark, and then a long cry. Then there was a disgusting sound of liquid being spilled on the ground suddenly. Todoroki? Midoriya called out one more time. He silently begged him to answer. There was a thud. I passed out. Todoroki whispered. He sounded like he was in a lot of pain and dazed. The little villain covered his mouth, unable to verbalize his relief and his guilt. He threw up. There was the sound of a jingling collar. He must have been petting Zuzu. Thanks for waking me up. Midoriya approved of the dog now. I'm coming to get you. Put your location on. You're staying here tonight? Midoriya jumped off the stool and was about to go to the door when Shigaraki grabbed his wrist to stop him. He pointed to Kurogiri, who was standing right beside the door. My, Dad and I are going to come get you. Do you think you can make it outside? He could hear Todoroki struggling to get up. Yeah. There's a wall surrounding the mansion. I can use my dash, he fell. My ice to get over it? Midoriya cringed hearing him struggle so much. Okay. When you get on top, close your eyes. Can you do that? My dad's quirk works when you don't look. He lied. He had to. I'm coming to get you. Darkness felt so soothing like this. There was no pain to be felt when drifting around in the nothingness that takes over. It was so peaceful. It was so quiet. There was no yelling or shouting, no roaring that bounced off the walls. There was no quaking in the floor from heavy, angry footsteps. There was no light, no fire to burn and claw at the skin. In a world of emptiness, there were no expectations to be met, no pressures to bear, no feelings to be felt. The numbness was soothing. This place was lovely. It felt wonderful. Could things feel like this forever? It would be nice, wouldn't it? Shudo, are you there? A voice rippled through the darkness, the emptiness. It sounded so far away, miles away, an unreachable distance. Ignore it. Let it fade into the nothingness it came from and stay in this world a little longer. Forever would be a blessing. To blend one's very existence into this world and never feel pain again. But then there was something wet and soft. It repeatedly touched his face. Something cold and moist dabbing and pressing into his cheek. Though the source was not causing pain, it was beginning to rise in his stomach, his neck, his head, his leg. There was a body to feel all this discomfort. There was no nothingness. The darkness was fading, becoming lighter with colors that blurred together like watercolor. He wanted to go back. He wanted to stay there forever. But something was pushing at his head and a deeper sickness rising in his gut. Say something for fuck's sake. It wasn't all bad here, was it? There was a light. There was a medicine to take away most of the pain, wasn't there? It's been calling for him for a while now. And there's been something soft nuzzling him for quite some time. He could feel and hear these things. He tried to move, flexing his fingers and feet to ground himself in reality. He felt stuck to the floor, being held hostage by gravity and weakness. He tried to push himself and heard the excited pants and whines of the dog next to him, backing up to give him space. However, the moment he rose to his hands and knees, the sickness in his gut rose up so suddenly he couldn't hold it back. He vomited on the wood floor as silently as he could. It was such a disgusting sound nonetheless. Todoroki? Todoroki stayed on his knees sitting up and leaned his side against the wall, vomit dripping from the corner of his mouth. His eyes were glossy with exhaustion, blood trailing from his forehead, breathing unevenly in a panting manner. It was Zuzu that picked up the phone that was hidden under the low table in the center of the room and brought it over to her new owner. Once he took it, she felt her licking the blood from his head. I passed out. His voice could only make a whisper. His lungs felt so sore somehow. His eyes trailed to the mess he made on the floor. He threw up. Then his hand rose to lightly scratch the side of Zuzu's neck by her new collar. His frown weakly rose, but it did not make it to a smile. Thanks for waking me up. Todoroki would listen to Midoriya frantically speak to him. There were words to be heard, but they weren't being comprehended well. He tightened his eyes and held his head, doing his best to answer the light on the other side of the phone. He coming to get him, take him away from this place, and bring him somewhere safer. The anticipation of leaving gave him the strength to rise up to his feet and take a few steps to the door. But he became dizzy and the room spun in his head. He fell, making Zuzu yelp and run to his side, nudging his head once again. I'm coming to get you, he heard Midoriya say one more time before hanging up. He did as he was told and put his location on to be found. But there was no way his dearest friend was going to be allowed inside. He would have to meet him at the wall. He had to get up. Zuzu stayed close to Todoroki's leg as he kept one hand on the wall and walked. He had to get some of his things if he was going to stay the night somewhere else. Maybe even his school things if Midoriya was going to keep him there the whole weekend. Thankfully, his head was beginning to clear as he walked and regained a slightly better sense of balance. But Zuzu still stayed against him to guide him whenever he became shaky. She'd escort him to his room on the second floor, and the moment he shut the door she ran to retrieve his messenger bag. He got on his knees and watched as the dog ran around the room and continued to fetch clothes, his uniform, notebooks, textbooks, and eventually a black hoodie. He put the last item on instead of packing it, wiping his head and face with his sleeve to clear it of blood and vomit. Get your leash too, he said quietly. Who knows where Endeavor was now, waiting to find him awake. With his bag over his shoulder and Zuzu on a leash attached to it, Todoroki was quietly making his way down a staircase. Quiet. It was all about being quiet and staying unseen to the very end of his escape. He had to keep his father thinking that he was unconscious in the room with the low table until he would find out that he left without a trace. He stayed close to the walls and was careful when peering around the corners. The chance that he would run into his father would terminate his whole escape. His goal was to go to the front door and get his shoes and make a run for the wall because the gate would be too loud and noticeable. So is Shudo here? There was a deep, familiar voice in the house that did not belong to Endeavor. He heard it through a door he was about to pass to get to the front of the mansion. Zuzu's fur stood up as she heard footsteps approaching the nearby door. They were caught. Surely, he's hiding somewhere. Endeavor's voice calmly said as the door opened before the two could get around another corner. They became paralyzed in their path as the door opened in front of them, revealing Endeavor with All Might right beside him, dressed in a more casual suit rather than his hero costume. The two adults froze when they noticed them, making eye contact with Todoroki, deer in the headlights. But maybe this was also a chance. Endeavor's face went from mildly frustrated to more intense anger when making eye contact with his son, while All Might was oblivious to it. The number one hero had his back to the number two, smiling down at the teenager that was practically frozen against the wall. The student soon straightened up and moved to the center of the hall to appear less suspicious, but he still seemed stiff. "Good to see you, young man," All Might greeted, though he didn't add anything to it. He stood silently and just stared Todoroki. Perhaps waiting for a response? Or maybe looking for an expression to read. His face was clear of vomit and blood, though there were traces of it underneath his hair. If only he could see the burns on his neck that the hoodie was hiding. "Good even." Todoroki went to respond with his voice still strained when Endeavor cut him off. "What is your business here, All Might, really?" Endeavor never broke glaring eye contact with his son, like a warning to be careful with his words. All Might glanced back and rubbed the back of his neck awkwardly. "Well, he then peered back and forth at the father and son that were both staring at him now. "Is there something wrong with visiting an old friend and seeing his family?" "Old friend?" Todoroki took half a step back with Zuzu following his motion. They were fellow heroes, but they were also acquainted enough for All Might to call Endeavor friend? Could this be his chance to let someone know what's been going on for too long? He drove his whole family away and has practically kept him captive here all of his childhood. If there was anything the media would believe about this, it was Japan's symbol of peace. But if he said anything that would give it away too bluntly, who knows what the hero behind him would do? Would he have the same fate as his brother? "Is everything going well?" All Might asked. The question was so vague and Todoroki wasn't sure how to answer. Almost everything was horrible at the moment. But with Endeavor glaring, he couldn't just say the truth. "It's okay," he answered. "Figure it out." "Pleasure, figure it out." "Just okay? Is there an issue?" Maybe he was catching on. "Become suspicious. Don't trust the one standing behind you." "Kinda." Todoroki shifted his eye contact from All Might to Endeavor again for one moment and saw him lower his head in a spiteful glare. He was demanding him not to make a scene in front of All Might. But All Might at least noticed the teenager's glance. "What's the problem? There's nothing a hero like me or your father can't fix. Don't have faith in him. Don't compare yourself to him. He's not who you think he is anymore. Don't trust him. Don't call him a hero just because you're friends. Things aren't always good here." Todoroki watched Endeavor fold his arms and dig his nails into his upper sleeve. He also watched All Might's smile begin to fall. But the hero was quick to raise it again. "Well, what's the trouble? Doesn't he realize that this couldn't be said outright?" Endeavor was right behind him. "Sometimes we argue." Endeavor's eyes narrowed even more at Todoroki as the boy continued to answer vaguely. "You argue?" All Might repeated. He then reached to put his hand on Todoroki's shoulder. And for a moment, the teenager felt relief. Maybe that was enough to make him understand without getting accused by Endeavor for calling him out. Maybe it would get better now with the number one hero by his side supporting here. "Dear boy, children argue with their parents more often than you think. It's normal to have disagreements as you get older." And his heart dropped. He didn't understand. He didn't get the severity of this arguing. "Your maturity has at least improved," Endeavor commented to All Might with his face loosening but still appearing annoyed. "I'm only looking out for him. At least you understand a father's intentions. Don't play off of him. Don't pretend to be friends with him now. That's right. I'm sure your father just wants what's best for you." No, he didn't want what was best. He only focused on what he himself wanted. "Why are you siding with him? You're supposed to protect people. Although I would suggest going a little lighter on the training at home. Leave it to the teachers to push him." All Might looked back to Endeavor with that statement. And yet the number one hero appeared relieved all of a sudden. He truly was oblivious. There was no way that an old friend would purposely hurt his youngest son. "I see he even let you have a pet." That was kind of him, wasn't it? Todoroki moved his leg in front of Zuzu. No, Fuyumi convinced him. None of this was what it looked like. Why can't you see past it? Are you really going to leave me here like this? And with that, All Might took his hand back and turned to face the adult standing behind him, leaving Todoroki to stare at them both in disbelief. He tried to speak, but All Might spoke over him on accident and couldn't hear him. So I hear your agency is doing better than ever? They were making small talk now. He couldn't talk over them. His throat hurt too much. It is. There are many promising sidekicks. Endeavor boasted. Please. You were always a good leader. I wouldn't expect anything less from my old rival. All Might mused. Todoroki was left ignored. Ignored by his secret idol. He wanted to be a hero just like him, right? It's why he put up with everything for this long. He was supposed to save everyone who was in trouble. But here he was, turning his back on someone who needed his help, too blinded by his biases to consider for more than a moment that something may be terribly wrong in this mansion. It was like he was even trying to avoid finding it out in the first place, like it was too painful or too much trouble to assume that his old friend was no hero. People who abandon others for what they want are no heroes. All Might was no hero. Do you see him? Kurogyari lifted Midoriya onto his shoulders for the short teenager to reach the top of the wall surrounding the Todoroki mansion. The little villain was able to get his hands on the top and pull himself up, kicking his feet a few times to give him more push. Not yet, he answered. He had climbed up the side, so if Todoroki came out the front or back door, he would see him. He checked his phone to see if there was a text, and by the time he looked up again, he saw his beloved come out the back door with shoes on, his bag over his shoulder, and Zuzu by his side. He looked so tired. But something about his face seemed different, and he recognized that lifelessness in his eyes. The hopelessness. The sense that every dream he had was crushed in a single moment. Todoroki and Zuzu immediately noticed Midoriya and made their way to the wall before being raised up by ice. Sitting on their knees, Midoriya quickly hugged Todoroki and buried his face in his chest. I was so worried about you, he said, muffled by the hoodie. He would normally expect a slow return of the hug, but instead, he received nothing. He gazed up at his beloved's face and then cupped his cheeks, taking in the expression that could only belong to someone who nearly lost their will to live. To do dash after something like this, did Todoroki even want to be called by his last name? Did he want to be associated with his father by name? He left me, the taller teenager mumbled. Who left you? Midoriya tilted his head, still cupping his hero's face. It was then he heard talking in the distance and looked towards the front door. Endeavor, All Might? He quickly turned back to Todoroki, seeing how dead on the inside he looked. He was able to put a few pieces together, and his heart only broke for the boy he was holding. He knew exactly what he was feeling. Midoriya gently placed their foreheads together and stared right into the bicolored eyes in front of him. Close your eyes, okay? I'm getting you away from here. Todoroki raised his gaze just enough to make eye contact and found those bright green hues to be so beautiful, even with the red-streaked scar. He closed his eyes and brought Zuzu into his lap to hold on tightly while feeling the little villain's hands move from his cheeks to around his shoulders. His touch was so gentle and careful. Todoroki wouldn't mind having this all the time. Fall with me, the loving killer said so softly in a tone where one could practically hear his smile. Midoriya glanced down and saw Kurogyari had already prepared a portal below, thus making a clear way for him to pull Todoroki sideways to fall off the wall with him, holding him. They landed on something soft, both of them on their sides with Zuzu in the middle. There was a small bounce to their landing, cushioning their fall safely and comfortably. Midoriya sat up first and tried to examine where Kurogyari had dropped them off. The room was based on traditional Japanese aesthetic with tatami mats, a kotatsu beside a TV, warm lighting, and they were warped to fall on top of a low mattress bed. Although the room looked nothing like the hideout, Midoriya could tell instantly that Kurogyari had set it up specifically for Todoroki. It was why he asked what kinds of things he liked. You can open your eyes now, the little villain told him, watching his hero's eyes slowly open, but they still looked so dull. Zuzu got up once Todoroki had loosened his hold, and she began to investigate the room curiously. Surely Shigaraki wouldn't mind having a dog around, would he? Letting her wander, Midoriya sat beside his hero and watched him sit up to absent-mindedly look around at his new surroundings. He still appeared desperately troubled. He didn't do anything. He was going to leave me there. He muttered. His whole world had been shaken by having the #1 hero turn his back on him. It was like he never doubted Endeavor in the first place, like he was looking for any way to convince himself that he was innocent. He didn't try to save him. Midoriya was watching the love of his life crumble before him, and he could feel himself becoming more and more enraged. He hated All Might for telling him that he could never be a hero. But now, he wished he could do more than just kill him. Death would not be painful enough to make him understand how much he hurt Todoroki. The anger was building deep inside his stomach as his nails dug into his knees, watching his beloved's mental state break apart. How dare All Might call himself a hero when he does this to people? I'll try anything, Midoriya said suddenly, gritting his teeth as he gripped Todoroki's shoulders and making him look directly into his eyes. Don't listen to people like him anymore. They just take advantage of your hopes and hurt you in the end. You don't deserve that. He tilted his head and began to smile sweetly, brushing a little bit of Todoroki's hair back from his face as he sat on his knees above him. Such a broken boy could only find that soft smiling comforting, those glowing green eyes so alluring, his touch so caring. His voice went from bitter and angry to a gentle and loving hum. I'll protect you. I'll never do anything to hurt you. It almost as if with every word, there was a string wrapping around Todoroki's body. He was falling for everything he was hearing, staring up at the villain like he was the only thing that mattered anymore. You only need to trust me now. I'm not like them, you know? Midoriya kept petting the other's hair with a smile while staring at the empty eyes that were locked onto him. I'll never leave you like the rest of them. Their faces were so close like this. The villain was so in love with the beautiful, broken boy in front of him and was being hypnotized by his beautiful face even though he was the one doing the talking. You've always been my hero. You'll let me be yours now, right? It was like a string attached to the very back of Todoroki's neck as the little villain raised his chin ever so slightly. You're so hurt, Shudo. You've been hurting for so long and you need someone to lean on and take care of you. The killer holding him couldn't help himself and leaned in a bit closer. How about someone who actually loves you? Midoriya leaned further to bring his lips to Todoroki's, bringing his hand up to hold his cheek while he did so. Their inexperience was the main factor keeping them from deepening it, but there was a mutual affection between them as Todoroki reached up to hold the villain's hand and make an attempt to kiss back softly. The attempt was enough to encourage the other to press forward and move onto his lap, still keeping above him. His hands cupped both his cheeks now and rubbed his thumb against his skin. Although he's dreamt of this for so long now, it was Midoriya that pulled away first to keep it from getting awkwardly long. But he couldn't help but smirk with a slight blush, looking down at his beloved hero that finally had a life back into his eyes. He lightly squished his cheeks together and smiled an innocent toothy grin. I really like you, Shudo, he giggled. His secret was out. No hiding it now. And yet he didn't feel all that upset about it. Todoroki was paralyzed with a pink-tinted face and was just caught staring up at the little villain on his lap before a small flame appeared on the red half of his hair. It made the other giggle as he gently patted it out without a second thought. I really like you too. Midoriya brought his fist up to his own cheek and tilted his head into it. You can call me Izuka now. I don't want to call you by something you're forced to share with that old bastard. Making that cute face, Todoroki found himself slowly wrapping his arms around the villain's waist and hugging onto him, pressing his face into his chest. He was suddenly becoming a bit clingy. Shudo? Midoriya asked, appearing confused, but he wasn't against this at all. He felt him hug tighter at the sound of his first name. How was it that the big strong hero was now acting all cute and attached now? How about you go take a bath and I'll get my dad to make you something to eat? Though, I know this sounds sketchy, but don't leave this room. This place is super secret and my family is like super undercover right now. Had it been any other circumstance, Todoroki would have questioned all of this. But after being taken away from his own home so kindly and given this whole mini apartment space, it felt rude to ask questions. So with that logic in mind, He would never bother trying to impose and poke around where he wasn't supposed to. I'm sure he can make some high-quality soba if I asked. And then I'll take care of any of your wounds. Sounds good, right? Todoroki listened to Midoriya and nuzzled his cheek against him subtly in understanding, but he was adamant to let go yet. Does. But you need to eat too. Midoriya blinked a few times and felt fingers trail up his torso, and over his hoodie, over his ribs. You're skinny, and he hadn't forgotten his episode before they were both caught on the sidewalk. Midoriya still felt guilty for that. Alright, deal. And thus Midoriya came down the stairs to see Shigaraki playing on his phone at his usual seat at the bar with one leg over the other. Once he heard footsteps, he looked to the stairs and saw the little villain spacing out and poking at his lips and blushing subtly. Has our Prince Charming made it here safely? He asked, glancing over at him. Yeah. He's here, the other responded like he was barely listening. It caught Shigaraki off guard. No comeback? Midoriya sat down and kept tapping his lips and wrapping his arms around himself while appearing curious. Shigaraki just looked confused and turned to Kurogiri to hopefully get some kind of answer. What the hell happened to his little brother? What happened to the bickering about having a crush? All he got was a shrug from the bartender man, but he could just tell that he knew what was up. Could you make him soba? It's his favorite, Midoriya asked without much thought. And me too. Kurogiri paused for a moment at the second part. You'll eat a whole meal for once? Something was very different and it was making both of the villains uncomfortable. There's also something I want to do next week, I think you might like it. It was then that a red glow emitted from one of his eyes. Midoriya poked his head into Todoroki's new little room to find only Zuzu almost completely under the kotatsu with just her head sticking out. He could hear water running in the bathroom. That was connected to the bedroom and guessed that his beloved hero was taking a shower. He let himself in with 2 bowls of soba and one with just pieces of scrap meat, setting them down on the kotatsu. He sat down and put his arms and legs underneath for Zuzu to suddenly appear between his limbs. Midoriya just smiled at her and petted her head a few times. She woke Todoroki up and he was very grateful for that. And it seemed that Todoroki had gotten very attached to her, but she was a means of comfort for him, which made her all the better. We'll take care of him together, He asked and earned himself a sweet puppy kiss to the face. Giving her lots of pets, he noticed bumps in her skin, like wounds that were still in the process of healing. He wondered if it was abuse or dogfighting, or maybe neglect, like she was just dumped in the middle of the city and left to fend for herself. No wonder Todoroki felt so compelled to take her in. He was too kind to everyone and everything that was hurt. It's nice that she likes you so much, Todoroki said, coming out of the bathroom with just a towel around his waist and around his neck that he was using to dry his hair. Midoriya's face had never become so red so quickly as he tried to look away to hide it. Todoroki would be upset if he heard it, but... A masterpiece, the freckled boy mumbled too quietly to be heard. Todoroki was too young to be that fit, but there he was, toned muscles with a pretty face and hair that was so elegant when it was wet, he couldn't understand how he could look so perfect. Midoriya tried his hardest to not peek at him while he threw on his hoodie unzipped and a pair of sweatpants. Even with burns and bruises scattered across his skin, the villain could not deny the fact that his hero truly was beautiful. He wanted to stay with him, always. To stay with just him and only him here. Todoroki sat down on the other side of the kotatsu to have Zuzu move from Midoriya's lap to his, to which he was ambushed by pure puppy love and kisses. Midoriya just watched with a loving smile, happy to his hero across the table appear to be in a much better state of mind. He watched his arms wrap around the dog and return her affection with petting and ear scratches until she calmed her excitement. It's all right that she's here, right? Todoroki asked. It took a moment for the little villain to blink and shake his head to snap his focus back to reality. Why, yeah, of course. Anything you want is perfect, he stuttered at first, pressing his pointer fingers together. You're perfect, you know? He's wanted to say it for so long and now it just slipped out without thinking. He covered his mouth out of panic and turned away. How could he even look at him after saying that so bluntly? I think you're amazing, you know? He then heard the other say so quietly. Midoriya slowly looked towards the beautiful boy across the table, holding Zuzu close in his arms with his cheek pressed against the top of her head. His eyes appeared half-lidded, staring directly at him, through him, into him. They were locked onto him like he would never look away. What? Midoriya asked him to repeat because he was unsure that he heard him correctly, flushed by the sight before him. I think you're amazing, Todoroki repeated, the corner of his lip raising just barely enough to make a half-smile. You came back for me, you've been there for me all this time. It's amazing. Your determination and your kindness. Only for him. Only was his kindness apparent for him and his small family. But he was beginning to recognize a soft glow in his scarred blue eye. You always make these bad feelings go away. It's the best medicine that you could ever provide. A medicine to make all his pain go away. A drug to numb the cruelty away. He wanted it all the time too, to rely on it always. To be addicted to it. Obsessed. Empty bowls sat stacked together with 2 pairs of chopsticks resting on top of them were all that was left on the kotatsu. Zuzu was half asleep at the foot of the bed while Todoroki sat up on the edge, getting bandaged and taken care of by Midoriya. The little villain was kneeling behind him on the bed, wrapping bandages around his neck and shoulder where burns had been soothed with the best creams he had. This was, however, the most he had ever been distracted while healing him. He was already wrapped at his wrist and other arm with patches scattered across his torso, but now that was behind him, he hadn't noticed how toned his back was. It was difficult not to stare. They were both so silent now, so there was nothing else to truly focus on. At least until Todoroki flinched when a darker part of a burn was brushed up too hard by the cloth and made a quiet noise of pain through his teeth. Sorry. Midoriya suddenly became jumpy when he stopped staring and eased up on the wrapping. Did I hurt you? He then asked, gently grasping his shoulders and leaning forward so they could see each other. It was just a small sting on accident, and yet he felt crushed with guilt. Todoroki just shook his head slowly. You couldn't do that, he spoke quietly as he usually did. Midoriya stared into his eyes for just a few moments before he felt a small loss of control of himself once again. He leaned just a bit forward to kiss his lips like before. But this time Todoroki was much quicker to return it with the villain holding on to his shoulders. Once they parted a few seconds later, the villain began giggling and hiding his face into his hero's back. Perfect. Once the sun had long set, Midoriya would be found sitting up at the head of the bed with Todoroki fast asleep beside his legs with Zuzu squishing herself between them. Her owner had been through so much in one day. Sneaking out of the house in the morning, going on a fun date, getting caught by his father, getting into a violent argument, being knocked unconscious, having his idol turn his back on him, only to be rescued by a boy and his secret family and have sudden feelings emerge for him. Midoriya had been petting the sleeping teenager's hair as he slept, watching him carefully to be sure that nightmares wouldn't torment him here in this safe place. He smiled watching him, just taking in how pretty he was. I make all the bad feelings go away, huh? He whispered to himself. And it was then that his eyes narrowed. I'll make all the bad people in your life go away too. Elevator doors slammed open and Midoriya entered his laboratory with eyes bright red and void of any of the kindness Todoroki was falling in love with. There was a small groan from inside a cage as his only prisoner turned away from the light coming from the elevator. What the hell, man? Kosuke whined. Having been sitting in darkness for at least a day, the brightness was obnoxious. But Midoriya kept the lighting of the room dimmed with the most light coming from his desk as he hastily opened several drawers, slamming them shut when he couldn't find what he was looking for. Are you going to let me out yet? Kosuke grumbled, lightly kicking one of the bars. Would you stop with the slamming, it's so loo-fuck? Kosuke was about to sit up to see what the villain was doing when he cried out in pain from a needle stabbing into the neck carelessly. Kosuke just barely turned his head to get a peek at what was stabbing him and only made eye contact with glowing red eyes and a twisted smile of a teenager who's lost all patience. Hey, he stuttered, but his whole body was becoming cold and numb. I'm sorry, about your... Even in the lighting, he found himself focusing on the red streak coming down the villain's eye. See, can we talk this out? His hands struggled to reach up, desperately trying to grab the needle injecting a chemical into him. But before he could even get it past his shoulder, his whole arm dropped limply and his head tilted to the side without muscle power keeping it upright. Then he heard the cage door be unlocked and opened. The chains around his wrists and ankles also began to unlock and uncuff, and then he felt the back of his shirt's collar be grabbed and pulled. His body was too numb to fight back and get away. He was finally freed, but he was too weak to escape. "What are you dash?" Kosuke quietly asked, finding it difficult to speak as he was being dragged across the floor. "Making all the bad people in his life go away," Midoriya growled lowly without looking down at the person he was moving to his center testing table. It was so vague and Kosuke didn't understand right away. "I'm his medicine. I make all his pain go away." The fire breather was lifted onto the table with slight difficulty because the little villain was not physically strong. But it was enough. And like this, Kosuke was forced to look up at him directly as his wrists and ankles were restrained once again. "You've made him hurt so much. You've hurt him so bad." He tried so hard not to let it show. Kosuke watched Midoriya remove the muzzle-like object around his mouth, but even with it removed, he couldn't bring his body to breathe fire. He was completely paralyzed, only able to watch the doctor work. You can't breathe fire if you can't breathe. You can't cause him any more pain if you're dead. Midoriya put a plain black doctor's mask on and reached for a small rolling table that had labeled vials sitting neatly on the top and bottom shelves. He put gloves on his hands and began picking through them, searching for a specific one. Hold on. I'll leave him alone. This about Todoroki, right? I'll never even look at him again. Kosuke still had difficulty speaking, but the adrenaline in him was fighting the drug. It was to the point where his fingers were beginning to flex. And yet Midoriya didn't seem concerned. Kosuke was trying his hardest to at least turn his head. The moment he could breathe fire, he'd break out of here. This villain was quirkless. There's no way that he could lose to him. Kosuke shut his eyes and tried to focus on just being able to move again. To feel his lungs again. To concentrate on breathing. He felt so close to getting it all back so quickly. He forced a smirk as his chest heaved up and down, feeling heat build up in his throat. But suddenly a device was forced onto his head that was metal and jagged. He tried to turn his head but felt his forehead get deeply cut by a knife that was strapped to it. "Look anywhere but up and you'll be blind," Midoriya threatened casually. The device was some messed up invention that was meant to keep his head still and facing up, threatening to cut up his face if he dared look anywhere else. "See, come on, man." He gritted his teeth and still tried to turn but kept feeling blades slit his skin around his eyes, but the stinging pain was too much for his face to bear. His cheek ended up having chunks of flesh hanging off like sliced meat. The boy began to tear up from the pain. "I'm sorry, I won't tell anyone about this if you let me go home." There was no getting out of this with power. He was immobilized. He was the weak one this time. Just a test subject. "Must be nice to have a good home to go back to," Midoriya said without much emotion to be heard. "Shudo never had that." His voice then became sharp as he jabbed another needle into his subject's arm. Kosuke flinched and gritted his teeth, struggling to not move his head but tried to thrash his limbs to attempt breaking the restraints. The little villain pulled out a stopwatch and watched it carefully as the one on his table gritted his teeth, shut his eyes, and clenched his fists. He was forcing himself to keep his mouth shut until he couldn't anymore, and an inferno of flames blasted out and towards the ceiling, screaming as he did so. Blood dripped from the corners of his mouth until the flames stopped and he gasped for breath, eyes watering. But it wasn't much longer until his chest heaved and he tried to keep his mouth shut again. The flurry of flames would reappear multiple times in the span of a half hour, all while Midoriya took diligent notes in silence. When they stopped, he only saw Kosuke gasping with the lower half of his face and chest covered in blood spatter and smoke coming out from his throat. "Burnt lungs, right?" Midoriya asked, looking up from his notes and setting his notebook down and exchanging a pen for a marker. He lifted Kosuke's shirt and began drawing dashed lines on his chest. "I'll look at them later." The subject's eyes followed Midoriya as he wheezed, trying to find his ability to speak. Then the little villain went under the testing table where there were cabinets and he took out several needles, but not syringe needles. Then he proceeded to jab them into different points of the subject's body, watching his reaction to each puncture. After every one, he wrote something now, as if testing which parts were more painful to stab. Between teeth gritting, struggling, crying, and screaming, he was able to base the level of pain on those reactions. It was when he stabbed through his tongue that Kosuke began to speak again, but his voice was terribly strained. Stop. This teenager could tell this was all going to lead to his death, but this pain was not worth living a little longer. Fine, I'll do something else. Midoriya shrugged, taking some final notes and injected another drug into Kosuke's arm. And with that done, he took a scalpel and placed it at the top of the dotted lines he made on his chest. I hate heroes, you know that? Shudo should stop trying to be one. If he has to be aligned with people like you and All Might, you all would just ruin his reputation. He's far better than all of you. Midoriya began to cut and Kosuke's body twitched, although the pain was not as bad as it should have been. He numbed him so he would be still enough to work. You don't deserve to even be compared to him. You don't deserve to breathe the same air as him. You don't deserve to live in the same world as him. He heartlessly cut into him, letting blood flow out of his chest. Stop, it still hurt nonetheless. And now he was practically being forced to watch himself be used as a dummy for research. People like you just deserve to die. He pressed the knife just a little too hard, being careless in his anger, and made Kosuke cough up more blood. Fuck you, was what Kosuke forced himself to say, barely gaining Midoriya's attention. Why you feel nothing for him? You're the type that's selfish like that. If he was going to die, he was going to make sure he hurt Midoriya the only way he could in this situation. You just like how much of a pushover he is, you'll just use him. Wide red eyes were staring into him and not breaking contact in the dimmed light, shrouded in near darkness. Why you're not human enough to feel pain. But if he can? Midoriya wanted so desperately to shut him up. Demonic eyes still locked, he found himself subconsciously raising his scalpel above his head slowly. I'll fucking curse him, he'll have a fucking painful death. Kosuke began to smile with blood dripping from his teeth. He'll be in so much pain and one you can't save him from. Fuck you. Both of you fag dash, he began to scream as Midoriya lifelessly stabbed into his chest without blinking and twisted it painfully. Take it back, he demanded. But he only received screams as an answer. So he took the knife out and brought it down again. Take it back, he repeated, ignoring all his shrieks and the tears running down his subject's cheeks. Take it back, he shouted as he repeatedly brought his blade down, overwhelmed with hatred and rage. This would go on for quite a long time. Take it back. Take it back. Shut up. Stop your pathetic screaming. Take it back. He's mine, I'll take care of him. The screaming stopped. The scalpel was dropped due to exhaustion. Blood was dripping onto the floor. All was quiet in the laboratory underground. Take it back. Midoriya was left sitting on top of the hips of a corpse, blood drenching his face, his clothes, his arms, everything except his mouth and hands as they were covered by his mask and gloves. The night light was peaceful at least. The windows of Todoroki's room got a lovely view of some of the city, letting the moonglow and city colors illuminate it comfortably. Quietly sneaking in and shutting the door behind him, the little villain was silent in his steps towards the bed where a peacefully sleeping, beautiful hero was still resting with his dog nuzzled into his chest. And he stood at his bedside, above him, just watching him for a few delicate moments. Blood dripped from the upper half of his face to the lower, his hands were covered in it from the flow down his arms. His clothes had not yet been changed. He was drenched in the blood of the boy he just slaughtered, and all he wanted to do was see his beloved again. Without thought, he reached down to gently caress his cheek, accidentally smearing blood on it. Surely he would clear it later. I'll save you from all pain. I will. I promise, he whispered lovingly. My Shudo. Midoriya had pulled up a chair to Todoroki's bedside with the backrest facing the sleeping hero, letting himself sit backward and watch him for the entire night. He had dozed off at least a few times in the night but was able to mostly stay awake to just keep Todoroki in his sights. He was such a beautiful sleeper after all, he didn't want to look away for a moment. There was no trace of Kosuke's blood in the room after it was wiped from Todoroki's cheek, and Midoriya had taken a shower to wash it all away. Todoroki didn't have to know about his other life. Not yet. Surely he had lost an incredible amount of faith in All Might, but he didn't trust that it was enough to change his morals. He was too kind. When it reached a more reasonable time in the morning, Midoriya followed a fairly usual routine to sit with Shigaraki and Kurogiri at the bar where Kurogiri had already made breakfast for them. Although Shigaraki's had some sugary concoction that should not be consumed so early. "Someone looks tired," his older brother commented, watching the little villain sit down. Couldn't sleep. Whatever he had done last night in the laboratory was not settling well. He's killed before. He's tortured before. He's heard threats and cries of agony all before. But, wishing pain and misfortune on Todoroki with a last dying breath, it was bothering him. He would never let something bad happen to his beloved hero, but it wasn't like he was strong enough to protect him. He wanted to watch Todoroki sleep out of paranoia as if something terrible would happen to him just because his last victim wished it. In a state of drowsiness, he merely picked at his breakfast with his eyes closing for a few seconds at a time. "I saw your lab," Shigaraki mentioned after moments of silence. "You didn't clean it this time." "You usually do." He reached over and lightly poked the other's freckled cheek and received a small grumble. "He said something that got to me. I got worried about Shudo and wanted to check on him right away," Midoriya said truthfully, more than willing to talk openly with this family he had. He casually pushed Shigaraki's finger away and rubbed his eyes sleepily. "He died enraged. He told me that he hoped Shudo would experience a painful death." And he trailed off, looking towards the staircase that would take him back to the living spaces, suddenly feeling the need to go check on Todoroki again. "I just want him safe. I want him to be happy and feel like he's free to be himself here." Shigaraki's eyes were on Midoriya, but he noticed a very small portal appearing behind the boy's stool and a foggy hand reached to secretly snatch his phone. He glanced at Kurogiri and saw him put 2 phones under the counter while the little villain ate. He was getting Todoroki's phone number. "You think he's ready to come over?" Shigaraki then asked, eating a piece of chocolate which was surely part of a balanced meal. But Midoriya shook his head. "He's too nice." It was one of his favorite things about him. He's the type that would try to forgive his father and Kosuka for all that they've done if they showed even a sliver of hope for change. He doesn't have a hateful heart. Not like them. 2 brothers fueled by hatred and have a disregard for mercy against those they couldn't tolerate for more than a few minutes. Todoroki wasn't like that. He gets pushed around by the school, his father, and his classmates. I'll teach him how to hate them for how they treat him. Shigaraki watched Midoriya's phone be snuck into his pocket where it originally was by a dark fog portal. He never noticed. "By the way, what do Nomu eat?" he then asked, changing the subject suddenly. Shigaraki brought his hand to his chin. "Well, I think they'll eat anything. They eat vegetables, I know that." Midoriya made a small smirk. "You mean you gave it the vegetables you didn't want that Kurogiri tried to make you eat?" Thus Kurogiri folded his arms and glared at Shigaraki, who just rolled his eyes with a smile. "I won't disagree." Midoriya took out a notepad from his pocket, as it was rare to see him without one on him, and went to a section that had a sticker poking out of it. He had a sketch of the Nomo, but there were very few notes surrounding it. He helped provide the research to make this beast, and yet he knew so little about it. Todoroki was still sleeping, so he debated as to whether he should use his time to go examine it for a little while. It wouldn't hurt for a little less than an hour, right? And thus Kurogiri provided Midoriya with various types of foods in a large sack, and the boy went down to the holding room below his laboratory where the Nomu was being kept. He dragged the sack inside because of the weight of how much the dark fog dad filled it, always willing to help the little villain further his research. Entering the holding room as what was expected of a brain-dead creature, it was sitting in the exact same spot, completely still, wide-eyed, and chained at every limb. Midoriya fearlessly laid out all the food he had in front of it separately. There were citrus, vegetables, candy, pastries, fish, red meat, white meat, chips, bread, cheeses, and a small pile of heavily processed snacks. He then flipped a switch to unlock the chains and free the monster only to have it stay in its place. He took note of that. Even when given food, it will not eat right away. Midoriya then picked up a piece of bread and looked to the Nomu as he threw it as high in the air as he could. "Eat," he commanded, and thus watched the massive thing bolt in the air and land aggressively on the other side of the room with a loud chomp from its toothed beak. It only eats on command. It could also kill someone by biting. The little villain then stepped back and gestured to the long line of food he had set up. Eat carefully, he specified. Thus the beast slowly lugged itself to the mass of different foods and appeared confused as it tilted its head, making a small, low noise. It has difficulty following vague commands. Pick the one you like most. Does it have preferences? He watched it raise its head and make another sound, turning its head to look at all that was laid out, and ended up dragging its feet to the section of meat and used its hands to eat it much more calmly. It likes meat. Do all of them do? Or just this one? Eat your least favorite. He waited until it was finished to say his next command and saw that it went to the vegetables. So you have preferences? The little villain walked up to the creature as he had it eat the rest of the food and started getting a closer look at the way it moved. He walked with it, noting its pace and how it moved its legs. It had feet like a human. It walked hunched over because its muscle was too big on its back. Its brain twitched whenever obeying a command. It never blinked. There was a point where Midoriya held a loaf of bread and fed the monster by hand and then reached with the other to pet its beak. When it finished its eating, finished its command, it froze as the boy pet it. He smiled at it with a giggle. You're not so scary like this, such a powerful, aggressively moving and ugly creature. It was so tame under his hand and words. He looked into its eyes. It felt there was more than just a brain-dead creature in there. These did have a human foundation after all. Who was it? We're going to make a big impact together. He grinned happily but then flinched when he felt a vibration. He didn't pull his hand away but tilted his head at the feeling until he heard a low sound. Coming from it. Growling? Why? It purrs? Midoriya took his hand back and then rapidly wrote down more notes. Did it have feelings? Did it have a conscience? It's brain dead, but is the human consciousness powerful enough to surpass it in small bursts? Did something trigger emotions? He had so many questions about the source, but these were questions he would have to ask the man who made these things. Could you stick your hands out? Like, cup them together? He asked and then watched the Nomu cup its hands in front of itself and keep them low to the ground. It takes requests as commands. Midoriya smiled and then approached the massive thing and climbed into its massive palms, laying down in its hands like a hammock. Bring your head down, he gestured and had the Nomu's head come down to him as he continued to pet its beak once more and heard it purr again. I'll tell Dad to bring you lots of meat from now on. But I can't stop my big brother from bringing you his vegetables, he chuckled. I'll make sure you're taken care of here. Midoriya grumbled, tossed, and turned in his sleep while on his side. Shuto, he sounded distressed in his mumbles with his face scrunching. His eyes tightened and his hands clenched in stress until he pushed himself up in an awakened state. Shuto! He shouted, looking around panicked and finding himself still surrounded by the metal walls of the holding room. He glanced down at the giant hands he was still laying down in. The Nomu had been cradling him as he slept the whole time. It was clear, however, that he was gifted with a nightmare and his heart was racing with anxiety. He made sure to grab his notebook as he vaulted out of the monster's hands. I'll come back tomorrow morning, but right now I need to go check on someone. Without chaining it back up, Midoriya took the elevator up to the living space floor. Nomus didn't do anything without command and the little villain trusted it to behave in the holding room. Midoriya ran out of the elevator the moment it opened and went to Todoroki's door. He was fine. Surely he was fine. He would be in there, in bed, sleeping peacefully with Zuzu. He would be sleeping in, wake up refreshed and knowing that no one was going to hurt him here. They could talk for a little, maybe they could get a little closer, go out for the day to get some fresh air and be normal teenagers. He was safe. Kosuke's wish would never come true. He was gone. He could never hurt him again. Todoroki could live a happier life without him now. That's what Midoriya hoped when he turned the doorknob. Walking inside, he released a big sigh seeing milky sunlight peeking through the curtains and giving a warm atmosphere around the boy sleeping in bed with his dog by his side. His hair had gotten messy throughout the night, yet it was a kind of cute messy fluff. Midoriya found it funny that it may be because of the heat in his quirk. Underneath the white blankets, he seemed so comfortable and cozy if it weren't from the tears the sun made sparkle on his cheeks. He cried in his sleep often, though it was never sobs or whines. It was always silent and still. His face was beautiful and unmoving as a tear trailed from the corner of his eye. Midoriya couldn't help himself but to sit on the bed in the empty spot beside him and used the back his finger to wipe it away and then ran his hand through his hair gently. "You don't have to cry anymore. I'm H-," he whispered but then froze when he saw Todoroki's face twitch. Midoriya took his hand back as he saw his beloved hero's eyes open only halfway and saw that they were instantly drawn to him. "Hey," Todoroki said quietly without getting up, taking advantage of this rare opportunity to be lazy. So the little villain took the opportunity to run his fingers through his half and half hair again with a soft smile. Hey! He looked so pretty like this, he couldn't resist. He could play with his hair all day. He watched him even lean into his hand in an almost cat-like manner. "You want to do anything today?" Midoriya asked. Sleep? Sleep all day? Yeah. Todoroki closed his eyes and pressed his head further into the pillows, making Midoriya giggle. He couldn't blame him for wanting such a thing. But they finally had a whole day together and the first thing he wanted to do was go back to bed. He was so quiet and aloof, but he had a sleepy and juvenile nature. Going along with this light-hearted mood, Midoriya carefully crawled on top of him but kept most of his weight on his hands and knees. "Don't want to go out?" he asked cheekily. Todoroki turned onto his back, looking up at the little villain above him sleepily. He then reached his arms up and pulled the other down to bury his face in his chest. "We can stay right here," he mumbled. Midoriya just let Todoroki hug onto him and smother himself as he took advantage of his position and twirled red and white in his finger. "All day?" he asked. He felt a nod in his chest. His hero was a lot less tense in the morning and it was a new side he got to see. "You want a dash?" He was going to offer something for him to eat, but he was cut off by a kiss on the lips. The two pulled away and Midoriya held himself up on his hands again. Staying in this room all day with Todoroki didn't sound like a bad idea. Seeing him acting so soft and clingy, he caught himself blushing while looking down at him. His beautiful hero underneath him like this, he sat down on his torso and leaned down to cup his face in his hands. "This is fine," he mumbled and then resumed their kiss blissfully. His hands moved from his cheeks to his chest, feeling his heart beat rhythmically under strong muscle and fabric. He's always had such a strong heart, he remembered feeling it against his back on that rooftop. When he felt it on the first day of school when Kosuke shoved him into him. If only he could get even a little closer to it. "Midoriya," Todoroki mumbled, slipping from the kiss for half a second. But it seemed the other didn't quite hear it. Izuku, he was still getting used to the first-name basis. And yet Midoriya wasn't quite paying attention, too focused on their kiss and something else. Todoroki didn't seem stressed about it as he kept his eyes closed. But the third time, he opened them ever so slightly. "Izuku," he said just a little louder and clearer, making the freckled villain pause. Midoriya pulled back a small bit and opened his eyes. "Yeah, Shudo," he had gotten pretty invested in the moment. "Your hands?" He had no idea what that meant until he looked down and his face turned bright red. Too invested. Far too invested. His fixation on his heartbeat caused him to rudely sneak his hands underneath his beloved's shirt all the way up to his chest. Sorry. I'm sorry. I'm really sorry." He instantly pulled them back to himself and crossed them across his own chest. He felt so terribly embarrassed for doing such a thing. It was rude and distasteful to do such a thing when they had just started finding romantic interest in each other mutually. This was too far too soon. His impulse control had been deteriorating the more he's lived in a villainous mindset. But that wasn't an excuse. "Teach, that was so bad I dashed." He shook his head and looked away, too ashamed to look Todoroki in the face. In turn, inviting a gentle kiss on the cheek that had him stop his panicked apologizing. "It's all right," Todoroki's voice said ever so softly. Turning to face him, Midoriya saw a smile similar to the one he saw last night at dinner. "I'm not mad." Of course he wasn't. He wasn't the type to get angry at something Midoriya felt so guilty for. "Just ask me next time." He took hold of the other's hand and held the tips of his fingers against his lips, tilting his head and shifting his light bedhead hair with bright sleepy eyes. "You could never hurt me." And Midoriya looked at the beautiful boy pressing his lips into the pads of his fingers and felt a hard twist in his chest and stomach. It really hurt. It hurt to see him like this. Todoroki's standards of affection were so horribly low that he would let Midoriya do anything to him because he was so much nicer to him than Endeavor. That shouldn't be where the bar was. Shuto, Midoriya began. This is all right, he asked. He took his hand back and began fiddling with the lower rim of his shirt and looking down at it. Like, you want this too, don't you? You don't feel obligated or anything. Just because I got you out of the house doesn't mean you have to like me like I like you. It hurt so much. It hurt that Todoroki could be doing this out of obligation. And it hurt to let him know that he didn't have to do that. He wanted him to stay so badly. He's wanted this for so long. He's dreamt about it. His hands went from fiddling with his shirt to scratching his wrists by now. Are you sure you even like boys like that? So I care about you a lot. But I don't want you to force yourself. He felt soft fingertips touch his forehead and then trace down over his eyes where his new scar was. Todoroki silently traced the red line while tilting his head ever so slightly. By the look in his eyes, Midoriya could tell he was thinking. He was so quiet most of the time, it was obvious that he was constantly thinking. So much to say, but so much he didn't want to say, which would give him even more to think about. I like Izuku, he said quietly yet clearly. I want Izuku to have everything he wants. And I want him to be happy. He rubbed the back of his thumb under Midoriya's, seeing that they had begun to water a few moments earlier. I feel bad that Kosuke hurt you because of me. I was happy that you cared. He reached to pry Midoriya's hands away from his wrists to get him to stop scratching. So he held his hands instead and just looked at them for a while. And I care. I care about how people treat you and how you treat yourself. He had noticed that Midoriya did not take care of himself. He didn't care about himself that much anymore. His initial problem, the one that drove him to the roof of that school, had never gone away. I want to care for you as you do for me. It feels nice like that, and like this too. Todoroki raised his gaze to look at Midoriya's face. It feels best like this? It seemed that Midoriya verbally expressing his anxiety gave Todoroki the power to answer and provide him the comfort and assurance to ease him. The only thing he had to hide was his life, but he didn't have to hide his feelings and fears. He could talk to his beloved hero and his hero could talk to him. They were already doing that. Asking for help when they needed it and being there when they needed it. All the comforting assurance of this made the pain in his chest fade into bubbly warmth as he lost his control, wrapped his arms around Todoroki's neck and forced him to lay down again to hug him tightly. This time Todoroki brought his hands around his back without hesitation as he felt the freckled teenager nuzzle into his cheek and heard him giggling cutely. Soon, a cold nose poked at Todoroki's other cheek. Looking over, he saw Zuzu pawing at his shoulder and wagging her curly tail. He saw her and then saw her glancing at the kotatsu where there were 2 plates of a full breakfast sitting and then a bowl of scrap meat. She doesn't like to eat without me, he said, petting her head and then sitting up again with Midoriya. A hungry puppy was enough to have the two get up and move to the kotatsu. Midoriya watched Todoroki more than he ate and found it rather cute how he fed Zuzu pieces of meat in rhythm to how he ate. It seemed that she preferred it that way. It made him wonder if Endeavor tried to withhold food from her. Todoroki may have tried to fast or share his meals, which would anger the hero that wanted a physically fit to perfection son. While thinking about this, he tried to think when Kurogyari dropped the food off just now because it was still warm. Did he see anything that just happened? He blushed just imagining it, how embarrassing it would be if he did. Soon after the meal, Midoriya left to his room to change into fresh clothes for the day, leaving Todoroki to do the same. Upon returning in a dark green hoodie, he found Todoroki in a bit more color with a light blue plaid shirt over a white shirt and jeans. He got him out of bed after all. But it was likely due to Zuzu constantly walking in circles around him with her leash in her mouth. The mall okay? We could look at new clothes for you to keep here and get lunch too. Midoriya had never gone to the mall with anyone besides his mother before. This was something normal teenagers did, wasn't it? This was something couples did too? Yeah, that sounds good, Todoroki answered, kneeling down to get Zuzu ready to go as she did some tippy taps with her paws. It gave Midoriya the second to text Kurogyari that they were going out. My dad will take us there, so shut your eyes, okay? Without questioning, Todoroki shut his eyes and allowed him and his puppy to be taken to a small quiet area around the corner from the biggest mall in the city. Considering the existence of quirks, including quirks that make people gain parts and appearances of animals, no one questioned Zuzu being brought in, especially since she was so well behaved. With dog leash in one hand, Midoriya couldn't help but stare at his other hand. Amazing that they could kiss first, but he was far more nervous about holding his hand. They were simply walking beside each other in silence that he felt was terribly awkward, but saw that his beloved hero was focused and staring off at everything around him, always so observant. Always thinking. Why were there times that it was so easy to get close with him, to tell him everything he was thinking, to smirk and be confident in everything he was saying? And then others where he was too timid to even look at him in the eye or reach for his hand. There was a part filled with confidence, maybe arrogance, a desire for Todoroki to trust him unconditionally without reason. He craved his affection. He would die for his obsession. But then he was self-conscious, anxious, and worried that Todoroki was with him because he felt obligated to. He wanted him to have a choice and be true to himself before anything else. He wanted him to have self-respect, not an obsession. The things the little villain wanted kept contradicting. What did he really want? What life was more important to him? The one with a bloody scalpel in one hand, or the gentle hold of his beloved hero's hand in his other? Why did he need to think about these things now? What was wrong with him? Izuku! Todoroki had been a few paces ahead with Zuzu and stopped, taking hold of Midoriya's hand in his. It felt so warm. What's wrong? Could he tell something was wrong? Midoriya patted himself on the cheek a few times to get his bearings in reality. He was also checking to see if he accidentally started crying. His skin didn't feel moist. Todoroki just knew something was wrong, even if he didn't show any physical signs of distress. Even Zuzu had approached him and licked his other hand for comfort. Just overthinking. Midoriya answered with a timid smile before giving his hand a small squeeze. There's been a lot on my mind lately. But I feel better about it all when you're here. His beautiful hero's presence just made him more confused. But he still wanted him to be around him, always. Anyways, where do you want to start? With Todoroki's inexperience in clothes shopping and Midoriya's complete lack of fashion sense, the two tried their best to find outfits for the half and half hero. However, thankfully pretty boy nature instincts were able to kick in and save both of them. Though he was confused by brands and sizing, Todoroki was able to try and buy decent clothes, letting Midoriya hold Zuzu when he tried things on and paid. He was fine with carrying bags, but the little villain suddenly had a need to try and hold them with his skinny arms instead. He would let him have his way, but it got to the point where the little villain had to drag a single bag, to which Todoroki would take it back from him and get a pout in response. But halfway through their afternoon together, they stopped at a small cafe in the shopping center. Midoriya sat at a table and was patiently waiting for his hero to come back. And so he played on his phone for a bit, scrolling through news and social media casually. He paid a bit more attention to articles on the sudden disappearances case. They made him smirk. Endeavor was going in circles at this point. What the hell? The little table Midoriya was at shook as someone's boot slammed down on top of it. And he knew exactly who it belonged to. And when he heard the yelling and felt the slam, he did not flinch or jump. He merely put down his phone, face down, and slowly turned to face his old childhood friend that was wreathing in anger. Medical program? The hell is that? You were never into doctor stuff? Bakugo was dressed casually, probably out at the mall to do some personal shopping of his own. It was common knowledge that he couldn't hold his temper when Midoriya was in his sights. Guess the hero stuff just didn't work out? Midoriya shrugged, keeping a calm yet bored tone. His eyes had gone dark. Bakugo didn't intimidate him anymore. He's done things that would give him nightmares for the rest of his pathetic life. And you just gave up on it that easily? What the hell is that supposed to be? He was always so loud. Midoriya found himself closing one eye whenever the other opened his mouth in reaction and protection from getting spit in his face. Noisy, he grumbled, making a vein pop out on Bakugo's forehead. His anger was so over the top that it wasn't scary anymore. What's wrong with being a little realistic? A little realistic. That's what All Might said, wasn't it? Midoriya smirked at the thought of actually taking the liar's advice. How silly. He wasn't listening to All Might, no, he was listening to someone so much better. I just got curious and then gave myself a chance. Then I figured I could make a bigger impact doing this instead. He smiled with his cheek in his palm. Shigaraki guided him to this, not All Might. Todoroki inspired him, not the pros. Think you're too smart to be a hero? That better not be it. Bakugo took his foot off the table and instead slammed his hand down. He was just begging for a reaction that he was never going to get. Think you can look down on me like dash? Midoriya shut his eyes listening to him talk because it was so unbearable. When they opened again, they had that infamous glow while glaring at him. I never said that, he started sharply. You keep thinking people are looking down on you when no one is. It sounds to me that you're just an insecure adolescent who doesn't get enough reassurance even though he gets it from literally everyone. Maybe start listening to what people are actually saying and you learn a thing or two about how they actually feel. He wasn't sure if he pissed Bakugo off more or scared him into silence. But seeing him with such an odd face of confusion and shock made him grow a crooked grin. You have an amazing quirk, Kaken. How he'd love to see it forced to its max potential in life or death. He'd love to rip his arms open and see the damage to his muscles and tissue. What was his body's limits? No one's saying that you don't. You just think it isn't good enough when you look at people who are more skilled than you. I can't outpower you. He held back a giggle as much as he could, but it just made his twisted smile more sinister. But I could tell you which part of you is most likely to explode into little pieces if you go too far. Bakugo gritted his teeth and took a half step back listening to Midoriya go off. The freckled boy was inches away from snapping. He's seen this side of him toned down just once in school. But this was a whole other level. That cute little boy who wanted to help anyone and everyone in need, who wanted to be there for everyone with a smile, to protect the people around him no matter what. Bakugo growled and reached to grab the collar of Midoriya's shirt, leaning in to get close and personal. He wasn't afraid. He wasn't going to let this bastard get to him. You're not Deku? For once, he didn't shout. But even that was not enough to make Midoriya's crooked grin falter. Deku wouldn't say shit like that. What happened to you? The little villain couldn't keep his laughter in as he let a small chuckle escape him then with his eyes innocently closed. It truly sounded evil despite his cute face. But that cuteness went away when he opened his eyes halfway and they were bright red. The scar made them look more unkind. I guess the Deku you liked so much dived off the roof, just like you wanted. It was then that there was a small thud on the table and a cold hand gently placed itself on Bakugo's wrist. Do you mind? Todoroki had come back with 2 drinks that he placed on the table and now he was trying to keep the peace between Bagwo and Midoriya. Bakugo looked shocked to see his classmate together with the twisted boy in front of him. What the hell are you dash? He had seen them together in the hall and together at lunch period. But now they were spending weekends together? At least he thought that until Midoriya reached for Todoroki's upper arm and pulled him with just enough strength to bring him into a surprise kiss. The move made Bakugo instantly back off as he was nearly mortified by what he was seeing. The strongest guy in his class was being pulled into affection by the loser he used to bully and beat on all the time. But that loser had changed into something he couldn't understand, and it was something he didn't want to interact with anymore. When they pulled away after a few moments, Todoroki's hair had a small flame on it which Midoriya patted out playfully with his face back to normal. Should we really be doing that with people around? Todoroki mumbled, feeling his head to make sure the fire was out. The little villain just chuckled and blushed happily. Couldn't help myself. You were gone for so long, Shudo? Shudo? Bakugo's hand twitched hearing the first name referral. And seeing Todoroki become so awkward and soft-spoken despite having a cold and stern exterior in class made him even more confused. Why did he let Deku do that? How did he let Deku do that? That fire-breathing nobody battered him a lot, but that was probably to stay out of trouble and to keep from making a scene, even though that backfired in the end. This guy was a terrifyingly powerful quirk was letting this quirkless nerd pull him around like this. If they stare, then they're the rude ones. So do you mind? Midoriya said to Todoroki lightly but then turned to Bakugo with a darkened glare. Bakugo didn't know what to say. He didn't know how to talk to either of the teenagers in front of him. He watched Todoroki lift Zuzu onto his lap and then push the smaller of the two drinks on the table to Midoriya. I said you didn't have to get me anything, I'm not hungry. But thank you though, the freckled boy said but took it anyway. They looked like a normal couple, they were happy to be with each other. But Bakugo was just sensing that something was terribly wrong here. I don't know what you see in him, but something's not right with him. Be careful, yeah? The most he could do was give Todoroki a warning before walking off with his hands shoved in his pockets. But Todoroki only shrugged as he fed a small ice cream to his puppy that he had kept in his pocket. Why would he ever listen to someone that bullied the light of his life? By the evening, there were empty plates on the kotatsu in Todoroki's little apartment. The TV was on the news. Midoriya was leaning back against the headboard of the bed with Todoroki resting his head on his chest and the Zuzu taking a nap on Todoroki's abdomen. Todoroki looked half asleep, but it was likely the lazy atmosphere that was getting to him and making him all the more cuddly. It did not help that the freckled teenager was petting his hair again. He reached for his wrist when he tried to stop. "Can you keep doing that?" he asked. The little villain blinked and then giggled, putting his fingers back in the red and white strands. "You like it when I play with your hair?" Midoriya asked almost teasingly, to which he got a nod in response. It made him chuckle, so he proceeded to pet him with one hand and scroll through his phone with the other. This kind of silence didn't feel awkward. It was nice. "I swear that I will make these streets safe for everyone and their families. I will not allow these disappearances to keep happening. Finding the villain behind this is my top priority and they will be brought to justice by my agency. We know for certain that when these incidents occur, they are alone. There are never any witnesses. So it is highly recommended that you always accompanied by a friend or family member at night or in secluded areas until we have arrested the evildoer." The two listened to the TV to hear an interview with Endeavor about the sudden disappearances case. How Midoriya would love to laugh in his face because the same person he was looking for had his son snuggling in his arms like an adorable cat. "He makes it sound like they're going after anyone," Todoroki mumbled sleepily. "So far, it's only been heroes, criminals, or people who've had shady activity that disappear. He's just trying to make himself look better by protecting innocent people." He turned his head to nuzzle further into his little villain's chest. "He's not protecting anyone." Midoriya changed the channel, knowing his hero would rather not listen to the previous one. And they continued the evening relaxing like this in blissful quietness until the freckled boy started looking outside. It had gotten dark after a while and he began to think of an idea and then leaned his cheek on his hero's head. "You want to do something?" he asked vaguely, causing Todoroki to shift. "I used to sneak out a lot at night and I used to cause some trouble. Nothing dangerous, but it was still fun. And I was just thinking that it's been a while. Perhaps this would be an opportunity to get his gold-hearted hero more in touch with his dark side." He clearly had one. His temper being lost with Kosuke was no fluke, but rather pent-up anger and pain that needed to be expressed. "I just spray-painted a bunch of stuff and I got a lot of feelings out. You want to try?" He looked down at Todoroki to see him looking right back at him. "Sure. Really? Yeah. It's vandalism." "Sakai." Todoroki shrugged and Midoriya was almost surprised by it. He had to remember that his pure-hearted hero was still the rebellious type. But was he this rebellious? "No hero impulses want to stop me?" he asked, just checking to be sure. "Not really." It appeared that Todoroki would get more from his time spent supporting Midoriya than trying to stop him. And if the little villain was able to get some feelings out by acting in delinquency, then maybe the hero could too. "Let me tell my dad," Midoriya said, going on his phone. Deciding that Zuzu should stay home for this outing, only Midoriya and Todoroki were dropped off in a dark alleyway in the depths of the city in more darkly colored clothing. Todoroki opened his eyes to see where they had been sent to and appeared curious by his surroundings. Someone who was kept inside a mansion would usually be kept far away from places like these, and yet this was where Midoriya said he hung out a lot. Stray animals were creeping around, garbage and glass scattered, graffiti at every turn, and rotten smells filling the air. He's been sheltered from this part of the city for so long. Before he could become too curious, Midoriya took his hand and began walking with him, navigating the maze of alleys and backroads from memory. "My home life was fine, really. But I didn't like being cooped up in my room all the time, and I didn't have any interests to work with in the daytime. I spent a lot of nights out here blowing off steam, he explained as they walked, passing multiple tags on the walls around them. Blow off steam? Todoroki repeated. I was really mad at everything, and I still kind am sometimes. I was mad about being quirkless, and I was mad about how Kaken treated me and how all my classmates would laugh at me. I wish my mom had more faith in me. I wish heroes were true to their personas. And sometimes I just wish he stopped himself and shook his head. He didn't need to continue. You shouldn't keep things like that all bottled up. Sometimes you just gotta let the world know that it sucks. You're supposed to walk around and act like everything's fine, but nothing really is, so coming here was a good way to stop pretending. They both began to shimmy down a very narrow gap between buildings before popping out the other side where there were a few abandoned buildings, and they would be able to see a few stragglers sleeping in one of them for the night. Midoriya led Todoroki to an empty building that was halfway towards falling apart by going through a small hole in the wall with poorly placed planks over it. There was a big enough gap between the wood for them to slip through. You have lots to be angry about. Don't you think you deserve to break? You can show me how unhappy you are, you know? You don't have to hold back your real feelings from me. Todoroki took his hand back and held his wrist, suddenly appearing distant in the idea of vandalism now. Midoriya stopped to look back at him, baffled by his hesitation. Maybe this wasn't a good idea, Todoroki said calmly. The last time I snapped, I'm pretty sure I almost killed someone. I don't want to go too far again. If only he knew the one he almost killed had already been killed. Yet Midoriya was patient with him, knowing this was not going to be an easy change of darker heart. So he took both his hands with a smile and giggle. I wouldn't worry about stuff like that. He deserved it, didn't he? Then he reached over to flip the hood on his beloved hero's jacket over his. And you deserve to be pissed off and have a little fun. He pulled a black flu mask out of his pocket and hooked the strings around the other's ears to hide the lower half of his face. His eyes glowed bright green with a wide grin across his face. He was adorably alluring. You hold yourself back from doing things that you want to do because of the consequences and what people will think of you. Well, you can let loose here. You can do what you want. The world is yours with me. Are you sure that's okay? Todoroki asked quietly, his eyes focused on a random piece of trash on the ground. Is that really okay for me to do? With only his eyes visible to show emotion, he expressed an extreme level of uncertainty. Midoriya let go of his hands and went to go rummage around the inside of the abandoned building until he pulled up a loose floorboard. Prying it up from the ground, there was a small hole underneath with a black bag hiding in it. Picking it up and going through it, he stacked at least a dozen different colored spray paint cans in a line and then inspected them to see if they were all still usable. It's okay with me, he then said after at least a minute of silence. Do you need permission from anyone else? He packed up the cans again and lugged the bag over his shoulder before making his way back towards the hole they came in through. He looked back at Todoroki before climbing through and saw that he was following him. The only one's permission he needed was the killer he had fallen for. Midoriya took him to an empty brick wall that belonged to a vacant building not far from the one they came from. He put the bag down and picked out a red can to start with before shaking it well and removing the cap. Be careful not to breathe this stuff in, it's poisonous, he warned, putting a flu mask over his mouth and then beginning to paint. He left the bag opened on the ground for Todoroki to go through, but instead, the hero appeared content with just watching the little villain do his signature tag, Hero's Lie. He remembered seeing it around a few times and Endeavor pointing out how petty it was. There was one tag of it on the back of his agency once. But instead of being propaganda against heroes, however, he now realized it was more of a warning. A warning to not put all of your trust into such a flashy idol. For now, he just sat next to the bag and watched the other graffiti the wall in silence. Something about all of this felt wrong. He's done things to spite his father, but this was a willingness to participate in illegal activity. And yet, watching the green-haired boy blissfully paint, watching him smile and hum to himself, his eyes bright with a mischievous and fun-loving glow, he wanted to feel that way too. To be at peace with his philosophies about how he felt about heroes. Soon Todoroki stuck his hand in the bag and found himself a royal blue spray paint can and looked it over a few times, doing double takes between it and Midoriya. Do you think I should keep trying to be a hero? He asked. You don't have to try. You're already a hero. You're my hero, the other answered back so quickly, so casually. His back was towards him, hiding the smirk he was making. You've been my hero since the day I first met you. I felt like nothing. All Might and Kaken made me feel like nothing, like I should just give up on everything I worked for. But you made me feel like I could do anything. Heroes don't need colorful costumes or big smiles or even big muscles. Sometimes heroes can be a really pretty boy who's quiet most times, in a white hoodie, who told me I could still make an impact. But I think you should stop trying to be what Endeavor and All Might are. Being a hero is just a career title to them. You're not like that. You don't need that title. Todoroki stood up with his head down and began to shake the can before taking the cap off. He began aggressively spraying in a zigzag motion in the shape of a circle with royal blue and then grabbing black to spray around it aggressively. He moved his arm side to side quickly with his finger holding down the trigger as hard as he could. Inside the black, he added a red ring inside and watched the red drip down the wall from having too much sprayed it on the wall, and yet it appeared to be on purpose. And lastly, he took white and finally wrote words within his bubble of blue, black, and red. Never my hero. His left hand twitched afterward with a can still in his grasp. He felt like an idiot. Why had he been striving to be the same thing as two people he couldn't stand anymore? All his suffering was birthed from a rivalry with All Might that was only one-sided by now. His family suffered because of it. And even when he was right there, All Might never stepped in to help or even tried to notice the problem. So stupid, he felt so stupid. He felt so played, brainwashed with childlike fantasies of being like the amazing man on TV. How was it that he was still clinging to an idiotic dream like that? Midoriya watched the red can in Todoroki's left hand from the corner of his eye. He could warn him what would happen if he let it heat up too much. But he'd rather watch this play out as silently as possible and only speaking to fuel his inner emotions. It was cruel. But Todoroki needed to become more in touch with himself. No one came to help you, right? You think it was a secret that your family split up all at once? Surely heroes that worked with Endeavor would be aware of some instability in the household. And yet no one had done anything. There are exceptions, but they're not the majority. Like Aizawa and Yamada. They cared. But not everyone was like them. Midoriya was spray painting the wall around his signature tag, just de-stressing himself with art instead of violence. He didn't flinch when he heard a small explosion and saw red paint splatter over a small portion of his work. While he was calmly doing his thing, Todoroki was next to him with gritted teeth, his mask pulled down, and twitching hands, covered in splotches of red. Go on, don't hold back, the little villain encouraged with a calming voice. You can use your fire how you want. Even destruction. Endeavor used his fire to represent his heroism, using it for intimidation to bring his version of justice. Todoroki wanted to twist that. His fire would not be used for justice and saving, because that's what his father would want. It should be used for what it truly represents. It's your power. So make it yours. And that was a trigger for Todoroki's left arm to flare up and for him to focus a blast towards a small abandoned shack-like structure that was barely standing just behind them. Midoriya continued to peacefully paint with a tranquil smile under his mask with glowing green eyes as fire behind him illuminated behind him and made shadows against the wall. He heard banging of trash cans, smashing of abandoned items, smelt burning garbage, with the looming scent of smoke and exploded spray paint in the air. He let Todoroki blow up in a mental meltdown, keeping blissfully to himself while his hero cracked. He heard him quietly swear through his heavy breaths as he was wearing himself out. But it didn't stop a moldy old chair from being thrown at the wall beside him, and then while it was still up against it, blasted with fire to incinerate into ash in a moment. He didn't even jump at the slam or the intense heat. He merely giggled at it. His quiet, reserved, mature beloved was finally letting it all out. He would be a killing machine with just the right motivations. But for now, he'd let him do his thing for about an hour. Eventually, the loud crashing and banging became less frequent, the heat was less intense, the bright flashes making shadows stopped, and all that remained was a subtle heat, the popping of burning scattered garbage and smoke. Midoriya turned around and found Todoroki on his knees with his arms shaking and his head lowered. His chest steadily rose and fell as he heavily breathed to catch his breath. He was still covered in red paint splatter. Midoriya playfully walked around, picking up their half-filled paint cans and hummed as he placed them back in the bag one by one. He swayed a bit in his step like a carefree child until he zipped the bag up and strolled over to his near-exhausted partner, standing above him, in front of him. He pulled his own mask down before lifting Todoroki's chin with a sweet smile. "Your power is so beautiful. Just like you." He then leaned down to kiss him with his chin still resting on his pointer finger. His power was his. It represented him. His fiery passion, his hatred, his embarrassment, his anger. His cold exterior, his anxiety, his loneliness, his pain. All of him was beautiful. He loved all of him. He slowly pulled away from the kiss to find his hero with a single tear in his scarred eye as they were both half-lidded and tired. "I love you, Shudo," he whispered, moving a bit of his red hair back. It looked like he had more to say, but they both quickly turned to where they heard rummaging around the corner. There was a noise complaint in this area. It's probably a stray cat or some damn kids. So late at night? Such a pain. We gotta check these areas out, remember? What if someone else goes missing on our watch? It sounded like 3 cops coming for a noise complaint, and Todoroki was awfully loud in his breakdown. Midoriya quickly grabbed the black bag and took Todoroki's hand, making a run for it. By the time the cops trudged through all the garbage, they were long gone with a few small fires left unattended on the ground, illuminating their artwork on the wall. Hero's line and "Never my hero" had been slightly smeared in ash, but now a big black heart surrounded the 2 tags with one more written in white above them. "We fell.